Manhwa title in the right corner of the screen. Enjoy watching.
Suddenly, this girl realized that she was in the water. She could not breathe, but she was conscious. When she finally opened her eyes, she saw an unfamiliar place, and her hands looked very different from before. While she was trying to figure out what was going on, some man grabbed her and slapped her hard across the face. He accused her of ruining the family's fortunes, of being too careless and deciding to drown herself on the eve of her wedding. He yelled at her really hard and called her Haley's name, except this girl didn't know who Haley was at all. Her name is actually Kanye J. She has been very strange since she was a child and said strange things, constantly looking behind people's backs because I saw that horror there. But no one else saw what she saw, so everyone assumed that Kanije was possessed. Even without that, she's an orphan and very unhappy. People wanted to send her to a spiritual shaman to heal her somehow, but it never happened. Ija, abandoned by her parents just after her birth, saw things she shouldn't have and was taken in by her grandmother to raise, and she lived her life doing her errand. Kanye J was unhappy. Now she was generally shocked at what was happening, for she was in a place unknown to her and didn't even know the man who was beating her. But it was immediately clear that she was possessed by a man named Haley, who was now inside her body. Kanyeji tried to get out, but nothing worked. She couldn't feel the mistress of this body at all, and as she tried to find the reason, slowly memories began to surface in her mind. It was as if they were all in the water, and then Kanyeji realized that Haley had thrown herself into the water and was very unhappy. In time, Haley's soul was supposed to become a ghost or disappear, but a much worse situation occurred. Ichia didn't just inhabit, but bypassed into the dead man's body. Given this body's memories, Haley's father, Duke Duncan, was now in front of her. He kept beating up his daughter because he had invested a lot of money in her engagement, but she ended up ruining everything by attempting suicide. The beating continued until the emperor saw it all. He did not even expect that this was the method by which children were disciplined. Then he told the Duke to get the hell out of here because he was going to talk to his fiancée. From Haley's memories, the girl realized that this man was her fiancé and the ruler of this country. But the problem was that she couldn't quiet her trembling body. It was because I'd never seen so many vengeful spirits behind a man's back. It was frightening to imagine what he'd done to make them cling to him like that. The emperor looked at his bride and did not understand why she was shaking so much. He ordered her to stop shaking. Though she had committed a mortal sin before him, he had not come here to kill her. Haley had committed suicide on the eve of the wedding, and it had caused a great scandal. But now that the emperor had said it, the matter was beginning to shake even more. The girl casually said it out loud, but she still couldn't raise her head and be calm in front of all these creatures, except that the emperor laughed at her. He said he had come to talk, and they had only exchanged a few words before. He wanted to know, did she really want this marriage so much that she decided to give her life? The reason why this happened is that the marriage was proposed by the Duke. Only the girl didn't know what to answer because Haley's memories weren't complete yet. But still, Iya didn't want to die. Then the emperor suggested that she could not forget some other man. It didn't really happen in Aya's life, but it did in Haley's life. He gradually emerged in her memories. The expression on the king's face made it clear, but he didn't care what kind of man she held in her heart. Of course, he wanted to support her sincere love, but he didn't want to be recorded as an unhappy king. He wanted Haley to live longer, but if she was going to die after all, then let her die wearing a crown. Ija was shocked, not for the first time, confirming that she was the most miserable person wherever she went. EJ, who could see ghosts, was taken into the care of grandmother Yongsan, who was a famous fortune teller, and one day grandmother told Ije not to go to the water. The grandmother, to prevent the spirits from doing any harm, was careful about her visitors and was extremely frugal with her words. But at every opportunity, she told Icha to avoid water, to avoid all places where water flows. Icha knew the heavy meaning this could carry, for her life had always been miserable as it was. But Ija wanted to have a fun and long life, so she had tried to ignore ghosts all her life. But that was the way it was until now. When she came to, she found herself in the body of another man named Haley. In addition, the one who threw herself into the water met a man carrying a legion of spirits. She's also supposed to be the king's companion. Up until this point, she was just a girl who worked in the Highlands. Now she's in front of a king who gives her the choice of giving up the title of queen right now. Those spirits were looking at Haley and waiting for her answer, but the girl tried not to meet their gaze. She asked the king only one thing: what would happen to her if she refused? The king said that the reason for postponing the wedding was that the bride had a bad cold. But if she refused, it would not be a cold, but a deadly disease. Well, then she'd really have to die. A very unfair right to choose. The emperor enjoyed this funny reaction and asked Haley again if she would jump in the water again. It was a question that Ija didn't even bother to think about, because she wanted to live, and she wasn't going to give up her life for anything. At least as the king had said, it wouldn't happen before she wore the crown, and she had promised him that. The king said he would trust her, though his facial expression said otherwise. But clearly he had little faith in the words of someone who had almost died yesterday. But he was really going to turn a blind eye to his fiancée's mistake once. He called the Duke into the room. The Duke came and was just furious, all because he was in his own house, but he dared to be told when to leave and when to come. And then the king gave the Duke only one warning. His daughter would soon become Queen of Cayenne, just as the Duke wanted. But that means he can no longer touch Haley as he pleases. And if he ever wanted to raise his hand to her again, he'd better remember the king's face first. Yija was a bit scared because she could see this very evil aura. It wasn't something a mere human could withstand, and all those spirits behind the king's back were telling him to kill the Duke. They all piled on him at once and as if they were ordering him to kill the Duke, so the king could really do it. Except the king didn't like that damned thirsty feeling. His hand, where he held the sword, was ready to move on its own. Still, to keep himself in check, he hid his sword and simply listened to the Duke's answer, who immediately agreed. Iya watched this, and was even more shocked, for if the king were an ordinary man, he would have gone mad right now. But he suppressed all those spirits with his own power. The girl was still sitting on her knees, so the king held out his hand to help her up. He looked at her with loving eyes and gave her 4 days to cure her cold. When she agreed, he immediately announced that the ceremony would take place in 4 days. The whole scandal has already grown so much that it is simply impossible to wait any longer. This was the king's last favor to the Duncan family. He put his arm around Haley, for they would have to try their best together in the future, and he told her to make sure she got to where he was going to be alive. After that, he introduced some knights who would guard Haley until the wedding ceremony. At the same time, would make sure that the Duke would not raise his hand to the future queen, and returned to the castle. The Kingdom of Cayenne is ruled by King Roderick Perouse Blake. Carrying so much karma and resentment, it's hard to imagine how he has the strength to continue to be alive. The girl looked after him and had mixed feelings because she couldn't figure out who he was. The 4 days passed quickly, and at last came the day of the wedding, which was attended by a great many aristocrats. In fact, they were sure something would happen this time too that would cause the wedding to be postponed. They say that Duke Duncan is a very scary man, and that he was the one who pushed his daughter through to become queen. All this talk is also in Haley's memoirs. Although the memories are still incomplete and have many problems, it can be said that the king had already tried twice to make a marriage of convenience. He had only one condition. It had to be a weak, noble family that did not aspire to power. The king did not want to create relatives in the female line. The first bride died in an accident, and the second was poisoned, and the third had a hard time succeeding. Except no one knows that the third one actually failed too, because the real Haley drowned herself in the river and really died. But only EJ knows the truth. She waited for her fiancé, contemplating it, and the king came at last. He said at once that it was her last night in her native home. Though it didn't seem like this house was worthy of her missing it, still, the king asked what dreams she'd had today. Haley said she had a good time that night, but she couldn't take her eyes off the king, all because nothing had clothed him today. But that day there had been a great many evil spirits behind him. The reason why they had disappeared was unclear. Then she took a closer look at his face, and it was quite handsome, so much so that even Ija envied him. But because she stared at him for too long, the king got tired of it. Besides, she had tried to make him repeat things several times today. Haley said she was very nervous and apologized, averting her gaze. The king hated being lied to, and he could see she wasn't the least bit nervous right now. Haley was about to argue with him, because how could he judge whether she was nervous or not? But then the girl realized that she had made a mistake again. When she tried to be honest, and told him that she was trying to be careful not to make mistakes, because the king was a high-ranking man, and she didn't know much about him, and if she didn't hold back, she might make some misstep. The king immediately realized what she meant, so he told her to do things the way she was doing them now. When it was finally time for the bride and groom to exit, he held out his hand to her, and they walked out into the church hall together. The body's fixed habits were actually frightening to this girl. Ika had never worn high heels or such bulky clothes, yet she could walk so naturally in this outfit. Suddenly, she felt a slight breeze, so she wanted to know where it was coming from. Shocked, she raised her gaze to look at the aura emanating from above, and then she saw a passing spirit right above her. It was the first time she had sensed and seen such a great spirit. He was not like a ghost or an evil spirit, but he was on a higher level, so the girl could not take her eyes off him and paid attention to nothing but that. And then, when the spirit looked up and met her eyes, the girl came to her senses and immediately pretended not to see him. The king, meanwhile, didn't understand her behavior at all. Haley froze in place as she ignored his words. The girl once again continued walking with the king by the hand. This world was a strange and scary place. She couldn't stop thinking about it all. But in doing so, she had to proceed with caution and pretend as if she didn't see this horde of spirits. When evening came in the imperial palace, the king was drinking with, you might say, a friend. It was the commander of the first squad of Jade Knights. He felt that another proposal should be considered. I mean, there was no telling if Haley was that attractive. But contrary to what the king has heard, this girl doesn't seem so naive, though she's obviously not going to be easy to deal with. In fact, both of these men think that the incidents in which two of the king's brides died were because of Duke Duncan, and that he was the one who killed them. If the previous two brides hadn't been killed, he wouldn't have had to be related to such a powerful family as the Duncans, who have so openly stated their desire to be related to the royal family, and there's a good chance he's the culprit. But on the other hand, Duncan's daughter wanted to commit suicide. They didn't try to kill her like the others, but she certainly had no intention of becoming queen. That still doesn't clear her father of suspicion, though. The king is going to follow the Duncans and figure out how to use Haley to his advantage. The king continued to drink, completely oblivious to the time, but he wasn't about to abandon his bride on the first night. The commander actually felt very sorry for Haley. After all, she was still a young girl stuck on the king's chessboard. Except that the king thought quite differently, that this girl was the Duncan family's chess piece, and she was definitely on their side. So someone must be placed in the queen's chambers to keep an eye on her. This ended the feast, and the king retired to his chambers. The knights looked after him to make sure the king was all right today. It appeared that his madness had subsided. The king suffers a nervous breakdown and severe insomnia. As the symptoms worsened, rumors spread that the king was insane, and it got to the point where it was even hard to put him to sleep. Jade really hoped the king would be okay, like he was today. And even the king himself wondered. For some reason, he had been in good health for too long. But as he went to his bride's room, those evil spirits clung to him again, and it appeared that his head was about to burst with pain. Haley, meanwhile, was already ready for her first wedding night, and the pajamas she was wearing were too thin. Kanyeji didn't have that in her life because she was hiding in the village. It's not that she didn't want it. On the contrary, it's an opportunity because the ghosts of virgins and the ghosts of bachelors were particularly resentful, and that was in both lives. The girl wondered very much what sins the king had to suffer so much for, and then she said that she must promise herself. But she didn't have time to finish because, unbeknownst to her, the king was already standing in the room, listening intently. She screamed with fear because she saw a large number of these evil spirits again, although everyone was fine during the day. Unless the king was just on the battlefield or walking around the clan, yeah, even then there shouldn't be such a thing. The duke is very whispery where his child is concerned, and now that she has become queen, she must be happy. King sat down on the bed. His head was really hurting, so he couldn't do anything, and Haley was uncomfortable, but still she asked if he was okay. She heard everything those evil spirits were saying to the king, that he must kill, kill, kill. Haley didn't want him to succumb to the voices of evil spirits, so she tried to bring him to his senses while he still had his wits about him. Then she started shaking him in all directions and telling him that he wasn't that kind of person, that he had tolerated it up to this point, so he shouldn't lose now. Seemingly, though faintly, Haley's voice reached him. The king slowly began to come to his senses, but he ended up falling right into Haley's lap. It looked like he'd fallen asleep, but he was obviously feeling better. At this moment, Haley could still get a closer look at the king's physique, which was very good. He had a clear nose and chin. The shape of his head was just fine. The complete opposite of Iya and Haley. Moreover, even if he was weakened, he still had huge sentient-like eyes, just like during the wedding ceremony when Haley saw that spirit, as if it was a sacred energy. But she still couldn't understand why evil spirits clung to such a person. Iya recalled her grandmother's words telling her to remember that if she noticed the spirits, they would notice her. And if she meddled in the affairs of the other world, they would meddle in her human life as well. So she must do nothing, or it could get even worse than it is now. But Haley seemed intent on disobeying her grandmother's word, for this man had protected her from the Duke Duncan who had beaten her. Iya is only an ordinary person who sees spirits, and has only studied a little bit of what her grandmother did. She knew that if she contacted spirits, she would only bring damage. However, the wind of gratitude, for once, she wanted to help this king. At least so this man can sleep soundly tonight without all this craziness. The girl concentrated and began to use her power. At that moment, all those monsters turned their gaze straight at her. They started saying that she saw everything and was looking at them, and they couldn't stop laughing. These evil spirits were too many. They were not afraid of anything. The girl had a hard time getting rid of them. She didn't even know if what she was doing now would work, but she ended up biting her finger to use the blood. Ultimately, fighting ghosts is a battle of forces, and Ija used her blood, wrote a symbol, and then began to recite the spell. Dead people. Time flows differently in this world. The world of the living and the dead never mix. Unclean forces. Return to where you belong. And at that moment, the evil spirits, without realizing it, suddenly disappeared from this room. After getting something, Haley suddenly felt very bad, though she couldn't even reach a state of purification and only briefly kicked out those ghosts that would soon reappear. She decided to hide the amulet, written in her own blood, under her bed. Looked at the king's face. He could sleep well tonight. The girl repaid his favor, and her strength left her completely, so she didn't even make it to her seat and collapsed on the bed right on the edge beside him. When it was already morning and the birds were singing their songs, Haley woke up. But when she opened her eyes, she saw the king lying in front of her, who was already awake and staring dumbly at her. The girl overreacted and immediately got out of bed, while the king continued to lie quietly. Haley asked why he was looking at her like that, and then he pointed a finger at her knee. That's because the fabric of the nightdress was torn in that exact spot. He wanted to know the reason, for he did not remember anything happening between them this night, for he had gone to bed as soon as he came here. The king gave her a blanket to cover herself, but he still wanted to know who had done this to her clothes. If it wasn't him, Haley didn't even know what to say to make him believe it, and ended up just saying that she did it herself, probably because it was hot and heavy with sleep. The king decided to pretend that he hadn't heard that, and that no other excuse was forthcoming, so it became too embarrassing. He told the queen to rest a little longer and left the room. Haley was even more embarrassed when he pretended like he hadn't heard anything. The king was relieved that he wasn't the one who had done it, because the memories of yesterday were ragged and he thought he was on the verge of insanity. But it was also very strange that he felt clarity in his head, and since Haley had come to this castle, he had felt so good twice now. She gave the reason that she tore the dress herself because it was hot and heavy in her sleep. Obviously, that's a more truthful excuse, but even that's pretty funny. And so, 4 days after the ceremony, after a horrible first night, Haley never saw King again. She wasn't going to thank him, of course, but she was a little sad. It seemed like she even missed him, so she tried not to think about it. Haley decided to try to make a proper amulet, though she didn't have the right ingredients, at least yellowish paper or something. To start, she tried using the stuff she'd brought from the study. The reason for her action was that after that night, evil spirits started bothering her with questions whether she could see them or not. They told her very many bad things, that the king would cut off her head and would surely kill her because that was her fate. Haley was no longer afraid to talk to them, but she had already died once, so it would be too cruel to do it a second time. She'd gotten rid of the spirits in various ways, and even tried to put up a barrier, but they wouldn't give her a quiet life. So now she had to hide a bunch of amulets behind picture frames and under furniture. Haley was already thinking about the fact that she had helped the king for nothing, and if she had listened to her grandmother's words, there would definitely be no such problems. Then she suddenly heard crying, as if another spirit that hadn't left, though it wasn't evil energy coming from it. Haley went to the sound and ended up seeing a small creature that was very sad. Haley started to ask who he was and what he was doing here and if he wanted to go home. But then this not evil spirit said his home was here. Haley tried to calm him down. After all, she wasn't going to do anything to hurt him, and then the spirit asked who she was. The girl pondered the question herself but said her name was Kanisha. For the first time coming here, she was able to say her real name. Then she asked what the spirit's name was. But it turns out he doesn't have a name because no one has ever called him, and Iya is the first person to see him. Yes, this little spirit confessed that he was very scared. Next to the spirit, the girl saw a box with a large crack. The first thing that caught her eye was that the casket was over 100 years old. Old objects often contain someone's memories, which means that this is the spirit box. Perhaps because the box was ruined, it couldn't hide or use its powers to the fullest. Icha felt sad about it, but she couldn't fix the box because she wasn't good at it and could ruin it, and the spirit would disappear. But he was looking at her with that look to push pity and make her help him. Even so, she couldn't change anything. Instead, she decided not to let the bad forces come into this room so they would no longer scare this spirit. He was very happy about this, for then he would not be afraid. But he also asked the girl to leave what was in her hand in his house. He talked about the amulet and asked to keep at least one. It was very sneaky. But eventually the girl agreed and put this amulet in her jewelry box. This cunning spirit was very happy. He must have spent not 100 but 300 years. Iya, watching him, immediately lifted her spirits. It seemed to be the first time she was so happy and smiling since coming here. After another 4 days, Haley got sick, all because the energy she had put into the amulets wasn't returning to her body. That's why she couldn't do things that were beyond her capabilities. Nevertheless, there was still much to be done to stabilize this place of evil spirits. Haley carved the wood and made one bracelet, but it wasn't enough. She was also going to carve a table and put it in her room, even though she wasn't feeling well. And while she was doing that, suddenly she didn't notice the king coming close enough to her to ask what she was doing. As it turns out, the king had recently learned that the queen wasn't in the best of health, so he made some medicine and came to check on her. And right behind him stood the maid, Deborah, with various medicines. Haley thanked them, but then looked toward the door because bad energy was already showing from there. Ichya was very glad that the evil spirits couldn't enter the room, which meant that the effect of the barrier was there after all, and it wasn't for nothing that she had tried so hard. But still, the worst and strongest spirits she could not stop. So they still went with the king. Haley had to make the pillar faster and set it up so that even such strong spirits couldn't get in. The king became very curious about what she was doing with her trembling body, and then he picked up a piece of wood and was just as shocked as the maid. They were all thinking the same thing. It certainly seemed to Deborah that nothing had happened the first night between the king and his wife, but for her to decide to do such a thing with her own hands was very disconcerting. The king didn't react as embarrassed as the maid. He only said he would confiscate the knife she used to do it. The queen, who had only recently carried a knife with her, could not stay with him, so he confiscated it. Haley was just desperate because she needed to make an exorcism pole, but she couldn't do it without a knife. And the king immediately left afterward and told her to be sure to drink the medicine. In fact, he also came to see the report of the captain of the knights because he was suspicious. He was told that there was an odor of burning coming from the queen's room, and ashes were also found. The impression then was that, after the water, she had decided to throw herself into the fire. And also the knights learned that the queen carves something out of wood every day. So the king wondered for a long time what she was carving there, but never guessed what that thing was. Haley could only lay in her room and cry. The exorcism pole could be finished in a couple days, but in the end she had nothing to do. The only thing she could think of was reading a book. Or rather, it was Haley Duncan's diary. She'd brought it from the duchy here. When she started reading this diary, she learned very little information, such as the fact that Haley's birthday was October 17th. But she could not read this diary in peace, for the little spirit had decided to talk to Ije. He was very curious how she could see him, for many priests had visited this room, but no one had ever seen him. Ije said that many good priests could see spirits, and those who came here were probably liars. They pretended to be priests and only extorted money, and if you don't watch them, they can also steal something. Ije continued to read this diary, but was never able to make up for the missing memories. Haley lived her life without giving much thought to anything, and she didn't care about much of anything. She wrote almost everywhere without much detail. Ije even wanted to apologize to the wood the journal was made of. Suddenly, Deborah, the maid, entered the room to announce that a letter and medicine had arrived from the queen's ancestral home. But for now, the medicine is being tested for safety. Haley said she didn't need the medicine. "I don't think I'm sick anymore and I'm not going to take them." She only took the letter to read it. There were only hypocritical speeches from her father, who barely noticed her in the mansion. In the letter, he apologized for troubling the queen and sent her medicine. And as if he only wanted to ask one thing himself, Iya realized that she had to meet the king, so she called for the other servants to dress normally. In passing, she thought about what to answer the duke. She hid the diary of the mistress of this body who was supposed to be the queen. This girl had almost no feelings left. When the soul leaves, the feelings naturally leave the body too. Only people with very strong grudges or great ideals who violate the laws of the world become vengeful spirits or remain in this world. But still, Iya really wished she could ask Haley how she would have handled the situation. In the letter, the father asked if there was someone in the castle who served the queen and if people from the parental home should be sent. Meanwhile, there was a meeting in the emperor's reception room, and everyone was in a great commotion. All because it was said that the queen should take responsibility even if low-ranking officials plundered the kingdom's treasury. It was very difficult for the king to restrain himself. Evil spirits were still around him and inciting him to murder, but he had to restrain himself. Eventually, when he was as fed up with it as possible, he gave these people one last chance to speak up. But everyone was so frightened that they immediately shut up. Jade immediately noticed the king's poor condition and was going to stop him. 3 years had passed since he took the throne, but the dark side had only begun to grow stronger. Even if he was in such a position, it was still unthinkable for him to pull out his sword at the slightest occasion and drench everything in blood. It seems as if the king has become a completely different person. He is no longer the same. The two men who remained the figures of this horror were afraid to approach the emperor. Deborah advised the queen to go back to the room, and Haley of course agreed because she was determined not to get involved. However, when she looked at the king, she again could not understand why he was only getting worse. Evil spirits were consuming his mind more and more. Haley was already walking away when she suddenly noticed the king pulling out his sword, so she rushed over to him. At this moment, Jade was also already on standby to protect everyone. The king could only hear these intrusive thoughts in his head, so he pointed his sword at all the people annoying him. But at that moment, the unthinkable happened. The queen abruptly grabbed his arm, preventing him from attacking anyone. She herself didn't know how to be at this moment because she didn't realize she had come running here. She even blamed the maid who should have held her tighter. Ija tried to help the king come to his senses somehow, and it was really starting to take effect. The king himself didn't understand why he was gradually feeling much better, and his mind was clearing up, getting rid of those horrible intrusive voices. EJ didn't understand at first why or how the light had returned to his eyes, but then she remembered that the beads she had carved and made herself had finally had their effect, and the evil spirits had retreated a bit. She continued to hold him, and when the king's gaze cleared as much as possible, he finally saw Haley in front of him and tried to figure out what had happened. He then looked awkwardly at the people at the table, who lowered their eyes in fear. He looked at Haley again and asked her quietly, why? He had a look that told Haley not to make him repeat himself twice and explain what was going on. Actually, she had come to talk about the letter sent by the Duke, but since the king has a bad relationship with the Duke, it could cause him to have negative feelings and the spirits would go on a rampage again. So Haley had to say that she had come to offer the king a cup of tea, but she happened to be on the wrong time, so she changed her plans. The king didn't expect her to say exactly that, and all the people sitting around the table were nervous and hoping for the queen's help. Haley didn't know what she was saying anymore, just to make things right somehow, and she waited for Deborah's help. The maid finally understood the queen's premise, so she intervened and said that the queen liked the exquisite tea she tasted. The king immediately said to bring it, and finally everyone was relieved, and the king was done meeting with these people for the day. After a while, he was already sitting at the table with Haley and drinking tea, but the situation was very awkward. She couldn't say anything, and the tea tasted disgusting. The king asked what Haley was thinking and why she was doing it. He also noticed that she didn't like the tea. Sure, Haley was in a hurry and ended up doing the wrong thing, but she shouldn't have put on a show and told him he shouldn't judge her preferences. Because she said such a thing on their wedding day, it made the king laugh a lot, because even though he seems like a harsh person, he actually doesn't mind making a joke. The problem was that the evil spirits were still on him, and he was constantly haunted by headaches as soon as he was away from Haley. It's true that this man makes her nervous, but either way, Ichia hates to see him have such a pained expression on his face. So she immediately decided to move closer to him to discreetly help him. She said it was very noticeable that he hadn't had a good night's sleep, and suddenly she made a strange movement with her hand to drive away all evil spirits. Then she sat right next to the king and even took his hand. This behavior was strange to everyone, so they just watched in silence, especially Jade, who was in shock. Beyond, the entire palace knows that the couple's relationship is contentedly cold. So right now, Jade could only hope that the king's mood would not worsen after such actions. But he, on the contrary, only laughed, trying to figure out what Haley was doing and why she was touching his arm so strangely. Haley tried to act normal, not embarrassed, and explained to him that it would make him want to go to sleep faster. She had insomnia too, so she's dealing with it, even though it was another lie. The king had gotten used to the fact that she wasn't even trying now, most likely. In fact, now Yija was confirming her speculation that the king had been tormented by his spirits for so long because his energy was tangled and blocked. A person with energy like his is even more dangerous in such a state. Iksha knows better than anyone else how energy flows in a person's body, because before the exorcism was performed by the grandmother, Ija's role was to keep the person's energy in order. So now she began to pinch not only his arm, but also his shoulders and back. She told him to warn him if he got hurt, but that only lifted the king's spirits. He even felt good from such a massage, though he didn't understand why Haley was doing it, and just thanked her. People with strong energy would be unlikely to mess with vengeful spirits. So I wonder how many bad deeds this man has done in his life for them to cling to him so tightly, even though he doesn't even look like the ultimate scoundrel. EJ continued to massage him some more, and finally she found the right spot, which she pressed hard enough so that the smile from the man's face immediately disappeared. Icha felt she was almost done, and the flow was close to being restored. Suddenly, the king began to feel much better. He felt an inexplicable warmth arise from nowhere. His body gradually relaxed so that he even lay on Haley's lap. Ija was not at all embarrassed by her actions. She continued to probe his body even after the king lay down. When she was finally able to improve the flow of energy in it a bit, she was able to exhale a sigh of relief. For a while, it would now be easier for the king to endure the attacks of evil spirits. Unfortunately, Ija is only capable of doing so much, but it's better than nothing. Jade had been silently watching the whole time, but he couldn't believe his eyes that the king was really asleep now. Haley had to say that he must have been pretty tired, and when he got the massage, he relaxed a lot. Jade was so surprised because the king hadn't slept in days. In general, he had insomnia, but he had been especially jumpy lately. Haley told Jade to ignore it because sometimes people get very sensitive, but there's nothing wrong with that. The king simply had no other choice, so even though he didn't, he was possessed by those spirits. One of the subordinates covered the emperor so he would be warmer to sleep. Deborah at this point gave the servant an intimidating look, implying that the queen's shoulders were cold too, and she told him to bring a plaid for the queen as well. Haley was uncomfortable. She said she didn't need to and she had finished her tea, so she wanted to leave. But it looks like that's going to become difficult now, because the king has rolled over onto his other side and put his arm around Haley so she can't get up now. Everyone watching was shocked and very confused. These people seemed to be thinking about something strange, and Haley couldn't explain it to them. Of course, Haley wanted to tell them there were no smutty moves here, but even inside her something twitched. This man, King Rodriguez, just instinctively moves in search of pure energy from the amulets that EJ has, or because of virtuous energy. Since he has been plagued by dark and unclean forces for a long time, he tries to find a peaceful place. Eventually, Haley gave in and asked for a plaid for herself, too. Deborah had only been waiting for this moment, so she immediately covered the queen. Iya is tired as well. Of course, it wasn't as bad as when she poured her energy into making amulets, but nevertheless, tidying up other people's energy required intense concentration. Still, being with this man who had become her husband was actually exhausting, but on the other hand, she felt some strange warmth. After a while, when the king woke up, he didn't realize what the situation was at all. For some reason, he was lying on Haley's lap, who was also asleep. He immediately asked Jade what the situation was. Then the knight said that the king was having tea with the queen and just sat next to her and then immediately fell asleep. Of course, Jade didn't go on about how Haley had massaged him diligently before bed. The king was indeed perplexed, trying to remember anything, but it was difficult. He said he was on his way to put the queen to bed in a comfortable place and suggested his bedroom for that purpose, for it was closest. At this point, the servants wondered if it was true that nothing had happened between the couple on the first night. Isn't the marital relationship between them too good? The king couldn't help but notice that his body condition had improved again, and he wondered more and more who Haley was. After a while, Isha woke up, but when she opened her eyes, she felt like she was in hell, or had died in her sleep, or had relocated again. But then she saw pink hair and white toes again, meaning Haley wasn't dead. After putting all these facts together, Isha realized that she was just in the king's room because familiar faces were flying in front of her everywhere. She wanted to leave right now and immediately called for someone, asking them to take her to her room. Ija successfully escaped from a house full of ghosts. Deborah, meanwhile, was explaining the situation and thought from the reaction that the relationship between the royal couple was actually not as good as it appeared. Ija learned that the king had asked her to carry her to the nearest room so that she wouldn't wake up, and she wasn't really resentful of him. The king is such a strange man, and even in his dreams he didn't realize he was getting help from her, but he was trying to repay her in return. Iya had already even thought that she had done the right thing to help him, but in the end, she forgot to tell him about the letter. Back in her room, she continued reading Haley's diary. February 7th, 499. Her father told her to marry the king, but Haley loves Lawrence. This event happened 3 months ago when she was still alive. She didn't want to die and thought her father didn't love her. There's a lot written in this diary, but it's all short and the context is very strange, and Ichi really wanted to know about Haley to see how she would act now. Come to think of it, the king had suggested that they have dinner together tonight. Haley was surprised by the sudden offer since they've never eaten together in the 15 days since this marriage began. But in the end, it's for the best. Iya will be able to tell him about the letter from the Duke. Thinking back to what Haley had written in her diary, Iya tried to figure out why she had jumped into the water if she didn't want to die. Why had Haley been so stupid? I learned that fate cannot be avoided. Even if you can avoid a little trouble, you can't change the threads that run through life. Just like the deceased whose fate was to die, so was Ije's. People often say they don't like their fate. It is said by those who cannot foresee the fate that will befall them. I wonder how many people would love their fate if they knew exactly what kind of pain it would be and how deep it would be. I've never loved my fate. The king was already waiting for his wife at the table, and only now did he reflect that this would be his first meal with Haley. He didn't invite her over to have a good time together. It was just that Jade had reported a few days ago that Duke Duncan had sent a letter to the queen, and there was already a copy. There was talk of bringing the people of the duchy into the palace, and he was also aware that the queen was ill. The Duke knew the king wouldn't give the okay for it, but then it would all set up a trivial power struggle. And a queen who is a member of the Duncan family, in the future as a ducal pawn, can become the center of attention of the aristocrats. Right from this point on, we need to cross that at the root. That's why they wanted to put an insignificant aristocrat in the queen's place. But the king decided to use this opportunity to see what Haley is really like. Is she really the naive girl they all think she is? Or does she have an opinion? While the king waited for her, he wondered how to start a conversation about it. But, whatever the conversation, he wasn't going to accept the offer. He wasn't feeling well today either, and Jade was especially close to controlling it all. When word came that the queen had arrived, her husband grew angrier and angrier. But suddenly, without noticing it himself, a good aura surrounded everything around him with Haley's arrival, and even the air was cleaner. The king noticed that with each step she took closer, a fresh breeze seemed to surround her, making it feel as if another world centered around her. He couldn't ignore the fact that his headache went away again when he met her. It was really weird. Then they sat down at the table, and food was brought to them. At last, the conversation began. The queen said that she had received a letter from her father a few days ago. No one thought she would be the first to bring it up. so they pretended not to know the contents of the letter. Haley took the initiative, and the king completely forgot the original purpose. The girl asked if it would be acceptable for the Duke to send people from the duchy here. She even suggested that the king look at the letter, since there was nothing special in it, but she brought it anyway just in case. King had already seen a copy, so he refused to watch it, and only asked how Haley herself wanted to proceed. She asked in surprise, did he really leave it up to her to choose this time? The first time it was a choice, wear the crown or just die. When he remembered that, he laughed hard, but gave in to Haley. Jade, watching all this, didn't understand at all why the king was giving in to his opponent's speech. Haley tensely asked, is the right to choose fair this time? Her face was so serious that the king couldn't help but laugh. When she spoke so honestly, it was inappropriate, but it was even better. It had been a long time since the king had laughed like that, and his mood was constantly improved by this funny woman. Ika realized that everything was fine. She didn't know how she would want Haley to act in this situation, but she decided to speak her mind first. She didn't want to be influenced by the king or the duke, and she didn't want to take life lightly. So she said that she was going to write a letter of rejection to her father. It hadn't been that long since her arrival at the palace, and if such a thing was already happening, it would be wrong from other people's point of view. Jade breathed a sigh of relief that he wouldn't have to get into a pointless argument with the Duncan family. Except, the king thought, that's no reason to rest easy. At first glance, that might seem like a satisfactory answer to everyone present, but it is obvious that even if the request had been made to the king, he would have refused. Whatever the reason, the Duke would still have picked on it and started an argument. But the Queen explained the refusal, used in her reason, rather than blaming it on the king, so it can be said that he is now indebted to her. Ija, meanwhile, thought that if she refused, it would still be wrong to completely disown the Duke, even if she didn't know what might happen here in the future. The king was smart enough to notice that Haley was feigning innocence, but had figured out everything she needed to do herself, up front. Though she had deviated from her father's intentions, thus showing herself even more as a member of the Duncan family interested in politics, it could be said that she had the true blood of a true fox running through her. A girl with the name Haley and Duncan is quite interesting and was a little alarming to the king. All this time, they just sat at the table talking, but she finally asked if she could start eating. It was actually funny. The king gave her permission to not wait for him and start eating. The food already filled the table and smelled delicious, so she couldn't hold back. The more the king got to know her, the more interesting she became to him. But he did not shy away from the thought that it might be a little dangerous, for he was interested in the Duke's daughter. Even if only slightly, he was drawn to her. Maybe it was because the madness had intensified. He had to inform the queen that he was going to go hunting this week and would be gone for a while. At first, Haley reacted calmly to it. She didn't care. But then she wondered, like Yiji, that the king should not go hunting. The first of the 5 precepts in Buddhism is that he must not take the life of creatures. He must not kill, for that causes karma to accumulate in him. Roderick, a king who could be called a ruling beast. Peruse Blake, he had a nickname formed from his second name. He is a rabid beast, a nickname, of course, derived from his madness. Realizing his uncontrollable impulses, Roderick tried to alleviate them through hunting. But without realizing it, he was driving himself further and further into the abyss of madness. In just a few years, he made history as the king who hunted the most in the history of the kingdom. Ija understands his intent, of course, but hunting won't do him any good. The more blood he sees, the more karma he accumulates, and the agony of heavy sighs will only worsen. The king should not decide who should live and who should take their life. That's what Haley wanted to say, but if the king or the knights heard it, they would find it ridiculous. She didn't want to throw around meaningless statements. When she saw him off on a hunting trip, he approached her one last time and asked her if she had anything she wanted to tell him. Being outside the castle, he would be less likely to be attracted to bad spirits than usual. But Ija thought, why not go on a picnic instead of hunting? The king said she should ask him, for example, to catch someone hunting, but the queen said at once that she didn't need anything like that. He offered to at least wish her a happy journey, so she said so, even though she really wanted him to not go anywhere or kill anyone. She didn't know what else she should say or do at this point, but the king looked a little upset. He asked, "Will you not do as they do?" and pointed toward the other knights. Ija looked in their direction and saw that the girls were seeing their boyfriends or husbands off to hunt. They would seal it with a loving kiss that lasted for quite some time. It was very embarrassing for Itza. She blushed, and of course she wasn't going to do something like that. Only the king and Deborah were in suspense. Ija only thought about this obscene kiss, and her whole face was already full of different emotions, which made the king laugh a lot. In fact, he was just joking to observe her reaction. Haley was a little pissed, but told him to come back in one piece anyway. The king thanked her for that and then leaned down sharply and said in her ear, "Stay out of the water." It seems he was afraid she would jump into the water like before, so he asked her not to die. After that, he left with the squad, and Iya, watching the evil spirits above him, hoped everything would be all right. When he had already reached the night forest and the knights were riding after him, they tried not to chase too fast because it was very dangerous there. The king saw nothing at all. He heard no sounds. He simply killed every animal that came in his way. But he thought about the fact that he wasn't that kind of person and shouldn't do that. Because if this continued, the subjects of the kingdom might suffer. If Haley had been by his side at a moment like this, would he really want to kill her as badly? Just thinking about it brought a smile and unquenchable desire to his face. He got off his horse and began slashing the already slain animal so hard and aggressively that it caused the rest of the knights in the squad to be disgusted. No one understood why it was as if the king had turned into a different person. It seemed that there was really no hope for him to improve. Then a huge bear appeared in front of the king. Then everyone got their weapons ready and began to shoot arrows to save the king. They were telling him to stand back, for such a large animal could get hurt badly. Only the king heard nothing and saw nothing. There was only darkness before his eyes and he felt no fear. At night, Haley couldn't sleep and kept thinking about this man. If he continued to kill, his condition would worsen. Haley herself didn't understand why it bothered her so much, so she decided to take a walk to get rid of these thoughts. The little spirit, meanwhile, had already fallen asleep, so Haley was being quiet so he wouldn't wake up. Walking through the garden, she looked up at the bright moon and continued to walk around the huge castle. Then she saw the descent to the lake, but immediately remembered the king's words. Stay away from the water. Even if he makes Haley go there, she won't go where there's water because Grandma Yosin told her not to go there. Maybe because she's been told all her life not to go near water, Iya started out just watching from afar and has gotten used to it. As she sat on the stairs looking out at the lake in the distance, a sudden breeze blew and she felt a familiar energy. She immediately realized it was the spirit she had seen at the wedding. He got off his horse for the first time and sat right next to Ija for the first time at all. She pretended not to see him and waited for him to leave. But still, she couldn't hide her feeling, for this spirit was simply awesome. Even the god that Yosan's grandmother worshipped wasn't that cool. Ija still tried not to mess with him in any way, but a smile had already appeared on that spirit's face. He stared at her intently and asked if she could see him. Icha hoped he would stop talking to her, as if it were something natural. But the spirit realized from her reaction that she could see him and was very happy. But Ija wasn't that happy because she was a human and this was a ghost. Even if it's a guardian spirit, it's still a ghost. Aya decided she'd better just leave, but before she could even get up off the steps, that spirit immediately told her she wasn't the real Haley Duncan. It made Itzer wonder how he knew that, but on the other hand, it didn't matter. Even if it was a high-level spirit, perhaps he could discern her true identity, but Itzy still tried not to react to it. The spirit told the girl that Roderick was on his way here now and he was hurt. Itcha pretended not to hear or see anything, but the spirit kept saying that it was a severe injury and it was too bad that he would die like this, since he didn't even have an heir. When he mentioned death, Ija couldn't sit still and ignore it, so she stood up abruptly, glaring at the spirit. He was only more relieved that this girl could hear him after all. Ija was just furious that this spirit was now messing with a person's life. She asked why he was doing this. Thinking back to her past miserable life, she was so hurt. She asked this spirit why people like him would do such a thing to people. After all, it was this ability that made her so unhappy. Only the spirit told her not to get so angry, for it was true that Roderick was hurt. The problem is that even if it's a lie, Ika still can't do anything about it. The spirit laughed and told her that if she wanted to go so badly, she must hurry, for if she ran now, she might just as well meet Roderick. EJ got up right now and headed to the castle, to where the man was. As it turned out, the king was able to be wounded by this bear, so he was rushed to the castle, badly injured. In pain, he remained conscious, but he still couldn't see or hear anything. The only thing he wanted was for someone to help him. Ija kept running and smelled blood more and more strongly, and then she saw that the king had indeed returned. Inexplicably, there was an even bigger pile of evil spirits clinging to him. The people were waking the doctor and were about to carry the king to the bedroom. Icheje remembered how haunted it was, and that it would be impossible to rest there. The king shouldn't be in his bedroom in such a state. The girl didn't know how she should be, what she should do, so she was in a bit of a panic, but then she ran to her room. She tore down all the amulets hidden under paintings and in hiding places under the bed and everywhere. The little spirit was just shocked and asked her to stop, because then those evil spirits would come running in here again. Ichie apologized and promised the spirit that she would make it right later. But he was still very upset, because he had just woken up and there was such trouble right away. Yija ran to the emperor's room with all her might. If his mind and body are weakened, the evil spirits will become stronger. Besides, if he is injured to the point where his life is threatened, then everything he has must be used. When she ran up to the emperor's room, there were already many people standing there. They were discussing the fact that the king had fallen again and continued to chop the dead prey without letting go of his bloody sword. People were actually afraid to approach him, for then his wrath would fall upon them. But the queen was about to pass into the room without fear and asked everyone to step back. Everyone asked her not to go in there and go back to her bedroom. Only Haley decided to use her title to enter any corner of this castle. Meanwhile, the doctor was already running into the room, driving everyone out of the way, and the queen took advantage of this and ran after him, for no one was blocking her way. The most powerful and evil spirits that filled the room had already accumulated over the emperor. The evil energy was so strong that Yija felt truly sick as soon as she entered. Iya approached the king. He was wounded, but not seriously enough to be life-threatening. Then she realized that the spirit had deceived her. Aiki had fallen for the ghost's words again, and as a result, she had acted so impulsively. But then she looked closely at the king. He kept muttering to himself all the things the ghosts were telling him. They were telling him to kill, and they were filling his mind more and more, so that all his strength was channeled into the hands in which he held the sword. If injuries to the soul can be called wounds, then this man receives mortal wounds every day, and there is no one to tell him the cause, and no one to treat him. He alone endures it all. When he raised his sword-holding hand, everyone was frightened and moved away, but only the queen stayed close by and tried to bring the king to his senses. She touched him and spoke to him. The king only opened his eyes but did not regain consciousness. These spirits are persistent and do not retreat, though they should have sensed the energy of the amulets and rosaries. So Haley had to put up a fight. The first rule is strict adherence to the law. Evil cannot overpower what is right. Destroy evil and restore justice. Destroy evil and show the truth. All the evil spirits recognized this girl again, and were not going to leave her alone if she interfered with them. So as soon as she started to cast them out, they only became more angry and threatened. Ichi was going to stay out of the ghost business, but that's exactly what she was doing now. She heard all the words they said to the king to get him to kill her, but there is no one else but her. She is the only one in this world who can help him. So she is not going to back down and continues to use her power. To herself, she recited a spell to make the unclean forces disappear to where they should be. Roderick, meanwhile, was unconscious. He could see nothing, was in the dark, and could feel blood on his body. He could hear nothing, but he could think and search for a way out of this state. It took a long time until he was like a mad king to really get out of this darkness. Suddenly, in all this horror, he saw a light. Someone was calling him, but he was the only one here. Out of that light, however, he heard a familiar voice calling to him relentlessly. Roderick was finally able to come to his senses, and that's when he saw Haley in front of him. But she kept asking questions to get him to start thinking and held his hands. This time, she managed to save him.
Roderick came to his senses and asked why Haley was here. She was feeling ill by then because she was using too much power. She didn't really know why she'd come here either, but Roderick could at least thank her for coming. Ija decided not to be upset in the face of the weakened man and go rest so as not to interfere with his treatment. But as he grabbed her tightly by the arm, he asked her not to leave. Everyone was surprised that he had become so affectionate since Haley had come in. EJ was angry because he had hurt his arm and had gotten hurt himself because of this hunt. She told him never to go on something like a hunt again and even beat the king up a bit. We even got a smile on his face like that, and he asked why he shouldn't ride. Ija said with tears in her eyes that she loved animals very much, so there was no need to kill them. Roderick held back from laughing. Haley cheered him up for us, and despite the pain, he could laugh. And everyone present thought the queen had gone mad with shock. The physician had treated all the wounds on the king's body, and now it was necessary to leave him to rest. Only Aya stayed by his side and began to realize the shame of what she had done. And she didn't know why she was acting in a way that was out of character. But while she was thinking about it, the king suddenly said he saw a light in the midst of darkness and held out his hand, and Haley grabbed the hand. He knew that she had seen a lot of scary things coming here, and he wanted her to know that there was really nothing that could be done about it. And though it would sound irresponsible and helpless, he couldn't do anything about it himself, meaning that the king is aware of what's happening to him and how terrible it is. And yet, his eyes are so bright, not at all like the eyes of someone who has accumulated bad karma. Haley could no longer pretend she didn't know anything when this man was destroying himself alone. The king thought she was angry because he had caused her trouble, but that was not the case. Because she wasn't mad, he asked her to talk some more because when he heard her voice, he came to his senses. It was funny to hear it, but Haley recognized it was because of her energy and things like rosaries and amulets, not her voice. Still, she sat by his bedside all night and talked. 2 days later, the Duke of Duncan made a real fuss about the queen being ill again. She is a very soft girl and will not be able to bear to live in a strange place, the father said, and wanted to send some familiar servants from the parental home to take care of his daughter. King is honestly sick of hearing it by now, but Haley really is very weak. On the other hand, Ija was working fervently to rebuild the barrier in the bedroom and ended up being too overworked. The king told her father that the matter depended on the queen's wishes, but the duke said she could not make such requests, so he wanted to decide everything himself. He was acting too inappropriately, completely forgetting that Haley was now the queen. Still, he said he worried a lot because she had been his favorite child since she was a baby. The king wanted to ask the duke how he loved his daughter so much that he even beat her on the head and face. But Roderick did not ask this for the sake of the queen's authority. Normally, he wouldn't have worried about it, just shot the duke. But now Roderick felt something unpleasant. The duke said he wanted to see the queen in person and asked us to make an appointment. But Roderick was already counting the emotion from the duke's face, who had said as much, that the weak queen would be subject to his will after meeting her father. And in fact, everyone thought so. But the king didn't understand why all sorts of people took Haley for such a person, for she was quite different. The king said that nobody forbade the duke to date the queen, and he should not ask about it. The duke should do as he wants. The king said it so easily because he knew Haley is not such an easy girl. And after that meeting, Jade asked how the king could allow the duke to meet the queen, since she could really bend to his will. Roderick was beginning to have doubts about how well Jade was doing her job, because in the beginning, when he was investigating Haley Duncan, he said that she's a lady with a light and naive character who is very obedient and yet immature, and she's often referred to as a beautiful fool. Here it all turned out to be a lie, and the king was the first to notice it. He came to check on his wife and see how she was doing. Haley didn't even get up to greet him. Roderick still didn't understand why, when he walked into her room, he suddenly felt so light and good. But Ija understood. This time, she had set up a very powerful barrier, and she was pleased with herself. After all, after 10 years of working for grandmother Yong-san, Ija had become a shaman herself. The king thought Haley was sick again, as revenge for going on a hated hunt, and talked about how active her father was, saying he would send men to the palace. Ija herself didn't notice how she laughed because of this crazy duke. Roderick looked at her pale expression and such a weak body, and yet he decided to ask her if she wanted people from the Duncan family around her. Jade even tensed up a little because the king, instead of forbidding it, even gave her the right to choose. He actually wanted to test Haley's reaction one more time, so he was giving her the choice without noticing it himself. The illusion of being able to make a decision is a very nice thing, as is the question of whether Haley will wear the crown where she had no choice at all. She said she would write another rejection letter, this time more precisely. Then the king looked at Jade. But somehow the knight didn't feel that difference. Only Roderick noticed that Haley definitely didn't act like someone who was afraid of whoever was in front of him. And it wasn't clear what her intentions were at all. And then he suddenly noticed that wooden pole right next to her on the table and didn't understand why it was still there. He asked Haley what her intentions were. Since he was telling her to throw it out, it looked like she was now protesting the king. It did seem more logical, because the first night there was nothing between them, and everyone thought that this was the queen's way of trying to strengthen the marital relationship. And Haley didn't even know what they were thinking and said it was just her hobby. Everyone was shocked at such a nocturnal hobby, but kept silent. Haley also showed off a bracelet she made herself out of wood because she's good with a knife, but still she's not done with the stick yet and asked the king to give her the knife back too. The king didn't understand why she was so eager to make this stick even smaller, since usually all girls liked big ones. Haley was angry that big didn't mean strong. All the servants in the room were already freaking out over these ambiguous phrases, but the king was completely serious and thinking about his big pickle. He told Haley to hide the ugly thing so no one would see it, but she was upset because it wasn't ugly at all, and the great general of the world doesn't have to be pretty. At this point, the maid tried to change the subject and brought the king some medicine. For a while, Roderick watched this strange girl, but then I didn't notice how quickly I fell asleep next to her. Everyone was surprised again. The king's severe insomnia was constantly disappearing around his wife, although before even sleeping pills had not helped. Thought he relaxes so much around the queen because there is a mysterious power hidden in Duncan's blood. Ija looked at all this and decided to wake up the king because it was wrong to sleep like that. And he didn't understand how he'd managed to fall asleep, even though he'd just been in thought. But looking at Haley, for some reason he felt like he could get a good night's sleep right now. So he said he would approach her, and without permission, he lay down beside her. Deborah immediately kicked everyone out of the room and left on her own with the hope that the couple would now have a good time, but really lay next to her right on the edge of the bed because he could feel himself falling asleep. Ija would like to tell him to go to his room, but she herself remembers that it's impossible to sleep in that haunted house. Roderick wasn't going to do anything. He just wanted to borrow a small section of the bed. Haley couldn't kick him out anymore, so she even gave him her pillow. And although the king didn't want to take the pillow that belonged to her at first, Haley said she had another one. Roderick saying that he would support her sincere love, while he himself went to bed with her, was definitely wrong. But he even got a chuckle out of that sweet phrase. He didn't think Haley was capable of saying such a thing. But still, they both wanted to sleep. Ija had already fallen asleep, but suddenly the king spoke to her again. He apologized for the first night. Ija opened her eyes and was startled at first by his intense gaze. Roderick still couldn't believe that the dress hadn't been torn on purpose that night. So he said that if he got aggressive again, Haley shouldn't stand for it and better call Jade right away. He was referring to the pajamas Haley had torn to use as an amulet. Only the king didn't remember anything and thought he'd torn her clothes himself, and apparently he kept worrying about it. But it seemed even now as if he didn't believe her words. Even though he said he understood everything, Haley couldn't tell him the whole truth about the amulet because she realized he wouldn't believe it. The experience of falling under the influence of evil spirits and harming others was too much. Ija caught herself thinking that she was still interfering even though she had a lot of problems of her own. The king is such a big and strong man, and he's not even broken. That's how they never fell asleep together. And Haley woke up because it was really hot and she couldn't breathe. She directly felt a weight on her, and when she opened her eyes, she found herself sleeping right in the king's arms. He said he wouldn't do anything, but they ended up in a position where Haley couldn't even move. I shouldn't have trusted the words of ghosts and men after all. Haley tried to calm herself down because objectively right now he was like a sleeping pillow. A human sleeper and nothing more. Still, it didn't help get rid of all thoughts, especially when the king held her tighter to him and smelled her hair in her sleep. Haley just tried to think of the good things. Even if he's her husband, he's a sick man first and foremost. Haley started to count sheep to distract herself, but then Roderick leaned his bottom even closer to her. Haley became more and more embarrassed and continued counting sheep. But even the sheep were possessed by the demon of depravity. Haley thought she needed to escape the fate of a virgin ghost and enjoy an abundant afterlife, and right now is that time. Roderick pulled her even tighter and closer to him, his hand on her waist and traveling lower. Haley felt that now was not the time after all, and she tried to wake the king to move away from her. But here again, something strange happened. Not only did he not move away from her, but on the contrary, he just assumed a different pose, still being very close. Now she was lying on her bottom, he on top of her, and Haley was still trying to wake up the king, who was straight up against her neck. And it all might have looked like a sweet and romantic scene if Roderick hadn't been asleep, because he had his whole body weight on Haley, and she just couldn't breathe. That's how she had to yell and shove him to get him to wake up after all. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the strange position they were in, and instantly jumped away from her, not realizing what he'd done. Haley turned away, trying to come to her senses, and Roderick was getting very nervous because he thought he'd done something bad again. Then he quickly lifted the blanket with which Haley was wrapped and made sure the clothes were not torn. He was immediately relieved and began apologizing to Haley, but she was lying with her back to him, and when she turned, he saw this strange expression on her face. Then he realized he had better leave so she could rest in peace, but he still hadn't heard back from her. He thought she was really scared, but her reaction was a little different. Her whole face was red and a little in tears. Haley continued to remain silent, and now apparently wasn't going to talk to him. It was childish. Still, she said she wasn't scared, just surprised. She would never tell him how hard her heart was pounding, and how hot and ticklish she felt wherever they touched. And now that he's so heartwarming, Haley wants to act like a kid. She's never had one before. The king apologized to her once more and finally left, but Haley's heart didn't understand what her feelings were. Roderick was so delicate that his leg was constantly unconsciously chickening. And after all, it had been 10 days since he had visited the queen, and no one understood what had happened between them. Roderick refrained from going to see Haley because she might be embarrassed. He kept remembering that look on her face, and it seemed as if she'd gone a little overboard. It seemed as if she now thought all men were animals. But the king thought that now they were a couple and it would only get bigger from here on out, and now he didn't know what to do at all. Although this marriage was not at all by the queen's wishes, it only made matters worse. Jimmy slipped the king a very timely offering that came from the mining region. A lot of gems were found there, and they ended up making beautiful jewelry out of them. The king looked at this bracelet and immediately remembered that strange bracelet the queen wore. The bracelet was just awful. But Roderick couldn't figure out if it was too old-fashioned or if Haley was trying to stay ahead of fashion. His employees didn't understand why he kept pestering Haley, who had done nothing to him, and what kind of answer he wanted to hear. Roderick remembered that bracelet she had made with her own hands. Then a smile appeared on his face. He didn't mean to insult Haley at all. He looked like he was trying to make fun of this strange girl. Haley hasn't been idle these past 10 days. Right now, for example, she was in the library looking for the royal genealogy. And even though she is the wife of the king, she wasn't very keen on being given a book that only members of the royal family can read. Apparently, it was written in another language, but Haley picked up that particular book anyway, and then showed it to the spirit and asked him to read it aloud. But he was lazy and refused, telling her to get a book she could read for herself. The more secret the records, the closer they were to the truth, and Haley was very interested. She really wanted to read it. Besides, she hadn't even finished the journal she was writing. And all because when she started reading everything recorded there, she was, to put it mildly, not thrilled. There was no useful information there, but simple notes about how many frogs there were in the garden or what shape the clouds were. The interest didn't match at all, and it was unclear what Haley was talking about, so Itchy decided to look for another way. But now it was a shame that the spirit who uses all the barriers and amulets while in this room to keep scary creatures out of here couldn't even read a book to her because of laziness. Still, he talked her into it, and Haley immediately started writing down what he was reading, even though the story was more like some kind of fairy tale. The first king conquered with his holy sword the Daimon Empire, which ruled the continent through an evil spell. The fourth king, to celebrate the centenary of the empire for national unity, strengthened relations with Melon, Russell, and Duncan, so they were originally a different nation. The spirit read for a very long time because there were more than 20 kings and the spirit was already tired, but Haley made him read on. And so they finally got to January 27th, Roderick Ferris Blake. He was born in 470 and ascended the throne in 497. And that's it. There's no more information because the achievements are initially recorded by the next king. Haley concluded for herself that since it's the year 499, the king is 29 years old. That's 4 years difference from Ija's previous age. But as far as Haley is concerned, they're 8 years apart, and that's a lot. That's probably why he treats her like a child sometimes. In 500 years of change has been the fate of countries, 10 years in which people's fates change. The tribulations of the kingdom of Cayenne and King Roderick coincide this year. In such an important year, by coincidence, Queen Haley should die, and the soul of a man from another world has taken up residence here. It is like the inscrutable will of heaven. Spirit has been very happy lately because the king doesn't come here, and it's very peaceful. His scary stuff isn't around. Haley tried not to think about it, but since the spirit mentioned it, she remembered that day she made him feel childish. That's probably why he doesn't want to see her face and doesn't come over. Haley wasn't disgusted at all. She was just surprised. She was fine. She had no parents, and she'd seen ghosts. She was used to people turning their backs on her. Haley decided to personally return the book back to the library and look around the castle at the same time. She passed by the training ground and saw the king practicing fencing. They really hadn't seen each other in a long time, and he was so passionate about the cause, and Haley's heart started beating faster. Deborah revealed that King and Jade had studied under the same mentor before they won the title, and they often sparred because they were on good terms. They both have good physiques, but Roderick is like an elegant beast. Haley suddenly noticed that with each breath, the king's energy was cleansing itself. Apparently, talking to his close friends calmed him down a little. So he should just be around Jade, and instead of hunting, he should be fencing more often. Haley figured he didn't want to see her, so after watching for a bit, was on her way out. But the moment she turned away, Roderick ran after her and caught up with her very quickly, though he had been far away only a few seconds before. And taking her hand, he asked why she was leaving. Haley said she was going to her room. She tried to keep her distance and be polite because she thought he was avoiding her. But Roderick immediately noticed that she was speaking in this manner and told her to communicate as before. Haley was going to leave anyway and told him to go on about his business. But the king apparently didn't like the fact that she was leaving right now, and it made him nervous. Quickly from his pocket, he pulled out the very same bracelet and held it out to Haley. He said that the bracelet she was wearing wasn't very pretty, so this new one was better. Haley was happy about the gift at first, but then she noticed that the king was just judging her preference. It was true, he was always so rude. To remedy the situation, he told Haley about how the king, who usually doesn't even look at jewelry, as soon as he saw that bracelet, he talked about his wife and kept it for himself. Roderick even blushed. He didn't want Haley to know. But she realized that he just didn't know how to express himself properly. Still, it was very nice, and she said thank you. He'd had enough of her smile, so he decided to put all his business aside and go with her to wherever she was going to go. Plus, he knew Jade well, so it was boring to train with him. It was really funny to Haley how he felt about his childhood friend. She didn't know exactly what it was because she always had ghosts around her instead of friends, but she was so happy to watch King and Jade. A spouse's quarrel is like cutting water with a knife, and Jade knew he was done being a partner to vent his anger. King and Haley were just the two of them, and he was asking questions about how she was doing. But today he was a little more aggressive than usual. He admitted that he'd been afraid to come to her so as not to make her uncomfortable, but Haley was surprised. He reminded her that she had looked at him like he was nothing that day, and he had been mentally wounded. While that obviously wasn't true, they just laughed off the situation, and Haley was glad he didn't hate her. Roderick exhaled a sigh of relief that all was well, and yet he had avoided her for nothing. Haley said she likes the bracelet, but her hobby is cutting out bracelets herself. It takes a lot of effort, so she asked that her work not be devalued, but he still didn't understand it. Haley had strange tastes, and she asked him not to judge her preferences. And just the atmosphere started to get better, but an evil entity appeared behind the king's back. Haley quickly disposed of her with a punch, and though it looked odd from the outside, it went well thanks to her rosary. Roderick felt as if his shoulders felt lighter, but he didn't pay much attention to it. He had heard that Haley had borrowed a copy of the royal genealogy, and was surprised because he thought she couldn't read such a thing. Everything there was written in a language she couldn't learn. Haley said she was just looking at it out of interest, but she concluded that the people of the Duncan family had no right to read it, and also that the king was being reported on Haley's every slightest move because she was the daughter of a political opponent. But Roderick was worried about something else. The librarian had told him that he had made a mistake in talking to the queen, and he was worried that she might be upset that she was not a member of the royal family. Roderick thought that was why Haley couldn't get used to palace life. He decided to change the subject suddenly and told her about Arthur's forest. Haley had a vague feeling that she had heard of it before. Perhaps it was because of the memories of the previous Haley, but she was finding it harder to distinguish between memories these days. The king said that it was a sacred forest that had been passed down since the founding of the country, and no one could enter the forest except the royal family. He held out his hand and invited her to go there together, and without a doubt, she took his hand and agreed. And then they were in what seemed like a magical place. Haley was ecstatic. It was the first time she had ever seen a place so overflowing with sacred energy that she almost fell to her knees and started praying as soon as they walked in here. It seemed as if the impossible was behind this energy several times more powerful than the spirit her grandmother Yongsan worshipped. But the king did not see that even deep in the forest there was a glow. It seemed to him that it was very dark. The man did not feel anything at all and even suggested going back. Haley didn't want to leave, of course, so they went on walking. Until now, she thought it was best for the king to stay away from the haunted castle. So he often went hunting, as if he instinctively wanted to leave the place. Now I realize that I was completely mistaken. This is the castle that houses Arthur's forest, the strongest shield that protected King Cayenne from the undead. But then, at some point, it all went wrong. Haley watched as even the worst evil spirits couldn't enter or exit the forest, and Roderick's energy cleared immediately, and it was so pure for the first time. They reached some place, and the king proposed to stop there. He carefully placed a handkerchief over her so she wouldn't stain her dress when she sat down. This was the first time such care had been taken. Before, Haley had dug up wild vegetables and sat wherever she could. Roderick had told her not to come for one song. Since people didn't walk here, there was no telling what might be deep in the woods. But Haley knew that something bad could never happen in a forest like this, and it was too clean. She asked how often the king came here, and if he felt anything like good air. He really felt that this was a good place, but after inheriting the throne, he was busy and couldn't come here. Haley told him to come here more often from now on and to practice more often, like he did recently with Jade. But she spoke as if she would soon disappear, and the king thought it suspicious. Haley realized that he was unlikely to believe her. Not long ago, she had tried to die by jumping into the water. But still, she told him, she wasn't trying to die. People die when the time comes. So she asked him once more to return her knife, for he had taken it away, fearing that she would do something dangerous. But she said she'd really only cut it out, The condition of the rosary is getting worse, and these alone can't cope. You need to do more things like the post. Haley was stubborn, so the king agreed to give her the knife back, but still her words were strange. She said she doesn't try to die, but in other words, that's the same thing as saying she doesn't even try to live, because people die when the time comes. He told it like it is. Ikka really wants to live. She tried hard too, but no matter how hard she fought, you can't beat fate. The king has had these thoughts that this girl is definitely Duncan, but sometimes it seems as if she lives in another world. Every morning, she meditates to clear her energy and then reads books, mostly about the history of the kingdom. The wielder of the Holy Sword, Arthur Lux Blake, is a founding king whose childhood is unknown. He saw a rotten empire use evil forces to establish tyranny, and Arthur stayed with that sword and defeated the empire by divine power. And as the family of the Damon Empire collapsed, the Damon Empire began to separate. The Mellon, Russell, and Duncan families, who were once the great nobles of the Damon Empire, were later incorporated into the new kingdom of Cayenne and became the backbone of noble society on the founding day of the empire. And now the movement to restore the Damon Empire is complete. Everyone always talks about it since the ancestral times. However, the rebel forces have been continuing their resistance for several years now. The king always said it was imperative to nip this in the bud, but no one could do anything about it, and he was angry. Everyone fell silent, for they thought the king was again reaching the threshold of madness. It had been a long time since the last time. But even so, one brave man appeared, and that was Duke Duncan. He wanted his son, who was demoted 3 years ago for no reason, to be reinstated as commander of the Western Border Patrol again. Because the Queen's brother is the deputy commander of the Southern troops, and that involves the Queen's honor. Roderick tried to restrain himself, and he calmly said that the kingdom was currently favoring a policy of advancing south, and the Duke could not appreciate the seriousness of matters since he called the position of deputy commander of the Southern troops a demotion. The calm king granted the Duke's son a position of honor, but even that was like a pearl around Albert Duncan's piglet neck. Everyone silently watched the tension between the king and the head of the Duke's anti-king faction. The Duke tried to object to something, but the king told him to worry about his life. He wasn't going to spare the Duke just because he was the Queen's father. After these words, he left, and the Duke remained, trying to restrain himself. Haley calmly carved the figure out of the wood. The king had come to her again. This had been very frequent of late, but today he came in complaining about her father going crazy. This was the 9th visit in 3 days. Lately, things have been happening all the time, and the king has been coming to see the Queen. And Jade had thought at first that the king was just watching her from time to time, but now it seems to him that the king has really fallen in love. Haley just laughed at those words and asked what Duke had done again today. Roderick told her about the reinstatement, but Haley didn't understand anything because she never finished her personal journal. Her heart clenched at the mere thought of that diary. She was so tired of being stupid. But the king also asked if she was uncomfortable listening to all this. Jade was shocked at him because the answer was obvious. Cussing at parents, siblings, and friends is a sign to join the fight, even if it's just politics. But Haley said that wasn't really true because things weren't perfect inside the family, and he'd seen it all for himself. Jade, surprised, listened to all of this. Haley Duncan had been mocked as a beautiful fool, and at first didn't understand why the emperor was questioning that reputation. But over the past few days, Jade had begun to realize that the queen wasn't stupid at all, and whatever she heard from the king, the most judicious man in the land, she took it calmly. She's always had a soft and gentle disposition. More accurately, she's close to aloof, just like the Duncan's political qualities. The problem is that, though the king fears it, he still somehow has an interest in the queen. He picked up the strange thing. It looked different now. He wondered what was written on it, because he didn't know the language. And all people wondered about it, because it turns out they were wrong, and it is not the toy they thought it was. But even as an aesthetic decoration, this object cannot be considered. King didn't understand why she wanted to do it, but Haley came up with the excuse that carving wood helped her control her mind. In fact, she didn't like the king distracting her with talk when she was busy doing business, so she didn't even turn in his direction. Roderick really didn't understand why she was pursuing a hobby that didn't befit her young age. Haley said that he doesn't match his age either and looks very young, so it's not even like he's 8 years older than his wife. When Roderick heard that, he was shocked because secretly he felt sorry for his young wife. He was so embarrassed he didn't even know what to say, and Haley laughed out loud. Laughing at the king, she didn't even realize that the age difference really bothered him. Mentally, they were only 4 years apart. Haley gave him one figure that she had carved herself. It was an army general, and the king would have liked to politely decline the horrible thing, but Haley said she had put her whole soul into it, and it didn't matter what it looked like. Even if it was a gift from his favorite wife, the king already wanted to refuse, so Haley just snatched it out of his hands and took it back for herself. But of course, she knew the king was just kidding, and he really wanted the gift. Haley says it's a talisman that protects against bad luck and nightmares. It looks scary, which is why you should put it under your bed. The king kept joking that instead of chasing away nightmares, this thing would wake him up from a deep sleep. But Haley still made it so the king could sleep well. She can't make an amazing amulet with her talent, but right now, the king needs at least a little help. Though Haley didn't want to say it, she said that sometimes there would be times when the earnest prayers of others would protect the king. Roderick was already embarrassed, except she didn't say it would be hard to receive. This fact makes life difficult for people, and it often used to make her very upset. When the king said that he originally didn't even think of refusing the gift, Haley was overjoyed and even gave him a second statue, the general of the great celestial empire. Still, he'll be better off with 2, and she can make a few new ones since it's her hobby. 1 general would be sad, so 2 is much better. Roderick was so embarrassed that he immediately wanted to leave without anyone noticing. Only Jade had figured it all out, and Haley had already managed to find a new piece of wood to make something out of. That night, Roderick placed the 2 statues right on the nightstand beside the bed, and as amazing as it was, that night he was able to sleep, even if only a little. But he realized immediately that they did have an effect, and this morning started out even better. But as soon as he moved away from them, the evil entities clung to him again, because all night, they couldn't get any closer because the aura of those figurines was interfering. But in the end, Roderick can't escape. He can't carry them everywhere with him. Haley meditated this morning, but longer than usual today, because she was a little freaked out about Haley's diary that she read at dawn. Usually it's so stupid it even gave me a headache, but this morning was different. On March 10th this year, she planned to talk about everything and leave Cayenne, even though she knew he would say no. She wanted to tell him even though he would say no, and she thought she really was as stupid as everyone around her said. Itcha's heart ached when she thought of Haley's lover, Lawrence. But when she thought of her father, the Duke, she felt nothing. This means Haley loved Lawrence so much that even after her soul died, her heart still responded to him. And it's unknown if she told him she wanted to get away together after her arranged marriage. I wondered how Lawrence was doing. Haley heard some noise in the hallway, and the spirit told her that Roderick was going crazy again, even more so than usual. Haley was surprised, for she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The talismans she'd given him seemed to have no effect at all. In her own strength, she could not deal with this problem. Ija had seen several times shamans who had ruined their lives by trying to do things out of pity that they couldn't do. It would be wiser to at least turn a blind eye to it now and not interfere. However, images of the king and Lawrence suddenly blended in Haley's mind. She didn't even realize how it happened. Haley didn't want to forget Lawrence, and Itzy didn't want to turn her back on Roderick either. I guess that's why their images were similar in one heart, and Icha decided to go to the king after all. So all around, Roderick was a real mess again, the voices in his head telling him, kill everyone. And it was now that he had calmed down a bit, because before it had been several times worse. Jade realized there was no use in stopping the queen, and said that Roderick wasn't going crazy now, but still needed to be careful around her. In fact, Jade didn't want the queen to approach him now, because things would get better after a while anyway. But Haley wasn't listening, because she knew that Roderick wasn't all right. He was only trying to overcome a strong impulse of madness, but no matter how strong it was, help was still needed. Haley approached him slowly and calmly. She spoke on a mundane topic, about tea to distract him because she saw his poor condition. She realized that if she used the rosary as usual, it would break immediately. The king had such a bloodshot look in his eyes at this moment, but you could also see how hard he was trying to restrain himself. Jimmy was very worried that the queen had gone to him, but Jade said that if things got dangerous, she would take matters into her own hands. Jade wondered why the queen always spoke at such dangerous moments. She must be terrified when a large man with an incredible lust for murder stands before her. And even now you can see how much her hands are shaking. It was because the evil aura always made her shiver, no matter how many times she felt it. Only the human heart is shaken, and Ija was able to pass on because she stuck to her intentions. He who follows the natural will prosper, but he who goes against nature will perish. He who adheres to the laws of nature prospers. For those who go against nature, perdition is destined. And the closer it got, the better the king felt, and he was shocked to see it all happen. The men holding him tightly noticed the strength leaving the king's body. They did not understand why. Haley told them to let King go, after which he could barely stand on his own. Coming to his senses a little as he saw Haley in front of him, the first thing he wanted to say was how well he'd slept. And those ugly wooden things really did have an effect. Haley looked at him so pitifully, and of course he didn't like it. But the strength was leaving his body, and he piled harder and harder on top of Haley so that he eventually fell over, and so he slept on her shoulder again. But people still marveled at the king's falling asleep as soon as the queen came, as if she were a human being. After sleeping for a bit, Roderick opened his eyes and looked at his hand. Haley held his hand, and it was as if she was giving him some sort of massage. He immediately remembered what had happened and told Haley not to go near him again when he was in that state because he couldn't guarantee her safety. However, those were too weak words for someone who wants to caveat. Haley isn't ready to give such statues to everyone, but she knows that this man has his own thoughts on the matter. She reminded him that she has Duncan blood in her, and she finds her own personal way of surviving better than anyone else. And she asked the king to treat her the same way he treated the other Duncans. Either way, she wouldn't get involved in something that could be a danger to her life. She was just going to stick to a certain temperature so it wouldn't get any hotter than it was now. Roderick hadn't asked before, but now he wondered what it was she was doing with his arm. Haley said unobtrusively that she was just relieving the tension after the training, because the king looked tired. But Roderick felt she was lying, and it wasn't the first time. She always lies a little and misses a little. Keeping an ambiguous distance between them, Jimmy observed a marvelous picture. Once again, the king had fallen asleep. However, if given the choice, out of these two beasts, Jimmy would be on the king's side. But for some reason, he feels like the queen is pushing a lot more than usual. But this time the little fox could be crushed because he was almost lying on top of her, even though he weighs several times as much. Haley asked Jade since when the king had been in such a state, and she wasn't talking about him being crazy. She meant since when did he have such a bad temper? It turned out that after he came to power, he started complaining of headaches, and it had been so aggravated since long ago. It turns out he's been putting up with all this for 3 years now, and it must be hard on him, but he's hanging in there, and it's incredible. Roderick seemed to be asleep, but his body kept moving, and he even hugged Haley because it was more comfortable in that position. She tried to wake him up so he wouldn't squeeze her, and Jade even turned away to avoid looking at her boss's family emergency. Haley decided to just lay the king on his lap. Judging by the way this man is clinging to the energy of the rosary, it means he's already at the limit of his powers, yet he's still sleeping so sweetly. Haley asked Jade to argue and negotiate with the king more often, like last time. But he doubted he could, because often the king is fierce when he takes up arms. Haley was surprised. Last time she'd thought everything was fine. But even if Jade's words were true, she couldn't say with certainty that a ban on taking up arms would be a great idea. She made sure of that after she hugged the king a few times because he has a sense of leadership. The sacred emperor's energy that could be called fatal. If he didn't try to control his every attack, Haley definitely wouldn't be able to contain it. But since sparring wasn't an option, Haley asked Jade to take the king to Arthur's woods more often to get some fresh air. Haley didn't realize why she'd forgotten that everyone but royalty was forbidden to enter, and she'd just heard that a short time ago. Ije's original memories started to mix with Haley's memories. That's why my head was a mess, and for some reason I had a sudden headache. Haley decided to go back to her room already and left the king to Jade. The next day, she slept more than usual. Yesterday, as soon as she got back to her room, she collapsed, tired, onto the bed. She didn't even feel like meditating today, and it seemed as if she could hear Grandma Yosin's displeasure. The rosary was still intact, though still tattered. And after last night, the king would be avoiding her again for a while, so Haley thought she'd spend the day taking her time. Despite what she thought, the king came to her again as usual, and she decided it was probably because of her father, who was rambling. After all, usually the king came to complain about the duke, but now that it turned out that she wasn't, she was indifferent. The king's chamberlain, Jimmy, was angry that she was so indifferent to the king who came to see her, but Deborah was on the side of the queen, who could afford to behave as she wished. Haley asked her husband why he came, but he said he didn't need a reason to come to his wife's room. Anyway, he came just for fun, like a patient walking in to visit the hospital. Haley recalled with a laugh the time when he didn't even want to receive gifts from his loving wife. Well, since he came, he offered to drink the tea we couldn't have together yesterday. Haley was drinking delicious tea and sweets, and Roderick was just looking at her and thinking deeply about something. Then he asked Haley to come over and do the same thing she was doing in his office, like a cat with her front paws. Haley didn't immediately know what he was talking about. It turned out that the healing practices of shamans, he called a cat massage. It was a shame Haley had tried so hard using her limited skills. Roderick said he couldn't sleep again, and her prayers last night didn't reach him, which meant she was thinking of someone else last night. Haley doubted the truth of his words because if her charms hadn't worked, he wouldn't have that satisfied look on his face today. She quickly uncovered his lies. He had gotten a good night's sleep today, after all. The Chamberlain and the maid had a psychological battle today, arguing about what was going on between the king and his wife. But Roderick and Haley heard nothing. They were focused on their conversation. Haley didn't understand why the king was asking for this, though he always thought it absurd. Maybe he suspected something? That was why Haley tried not to do anything that might seem strange. Roderick noticed that Haley was wary, but he didn't know what it was. But it was clear that she was hiding something. But it's not like she wants to hurt him or the royal family. At least that's how it was until now. Roderick didn't want her to be afraid. He just asked her to give that massage a little. But Haley pretended not to understand. She couldn't refuse and she had no choice, so she decided to just pretend so as not to arouse suspicion. When she sat down next to him and took his hand, pretending it was a regular massage. But the king watched Haley's hands carefully. For someone who had practiced a lot, she didn't have much muscle, and her fingertips were very... Then he took her hand and began to examine it closer. The skin was thin, but there were small calluses in some places due to the wood carvings. It didn't seem like a hobby that was enjoyable, and Roderick was pretty sure it wasn't something Haley had done before she got married. So why was she lying? He turned to face her to ask a question, but she completely forgot what she wanted to ask. Because right now, the situation looked like Haley was trying to seduce him. She didn't know what he was talking about until King clarified that the ribbon in the front had come undone. Haley hadn't noticed until that moment. Now her breasts were visible. She blushed and immediately started trying to remedy the situation. But because she was nervous, she had trouble tying that ribbon. Besides, it was always Deborah who had helped with the clothes up to that point. Remembering the maid, Haley turned around and gave her a look that begged for her help. But Deborah pretended not to notice. She had more important things to do now, to prove to the Chamberlain that she was right and there was nothing between the king and queen. No need to question the wisdom of the palace maids. Roderick noticed that the maid and Chamberlain were discussing something useless and not at all in a hurry to help Haley, so he decided to do it himself. The situation was desperate, so Haley removed her hands and let her husband help her, but her whole face was bright red. Such a thing could not be revealed, and Roderick smiled. He wasn't looking at her breasts at all, just her face. As he tied the ribbons, Haley began to resent him. He had to pretend he hadn't noticed until the very end, and now she was embarrassed by the indecency. Roderick couldn't keep quiet when he saw it, because then others would stare at her breasts. So she should be grateful that he was the first to notice. But surely he could have hinted at it at least in other ways. Roderick didn't, because those two servants pretend not to notice. Was he really supposed to write a note and pass it on? Haley was still very embarrassed, so King still suggested that it was his oversight to not see that look on her face. He even apologized to Haley. Besides, he felt better now than he had before. Haley wasn't angry anymore, but she sure as hell wasn't going to do anything that catches her eye anymore. However, Haley tends to repeat her mistakes. As always, nothing goes the way she wants it to. Well, it wasn't long before she had to do eye-catching actions. She had promised herself not to do it, but she couldn't pretend she couldn't see anything, so she was getting rid of those evil spirits. Haley wasn't at all happy about what she was doing because she was getting really tired. But the king was getting noticeably better. His condition was just fine. The report on the case he had previously ordered to be investigated had finally arrived. It turned out that the cause of death of the first woman who had become his bride was, by all accounts, obvious. The murder had been committed with poison. Until the second bride was poisoned, no one even knew that Duke Duncan would be so obsessed with the idea of inbreeding with the royal family. Also, someone found out that there is a diary that the queen brought with her from the duchy. The maids have noticed that this personal diary has about 10 chapters, and Haley, after arriving at the palace, sometimes opens it to read what it says, but never writes anything inside. The servant suggested secretly studying the contents of the diary. for there might be some important information about Duncan in there. But Roderick didn't want to be the brash man who reads the diary of his wife's youth, so he immediately abandoned the idea. Jade, of course, was of a different opinion. It was already very noticeable how attracted the king was to his wife. Roderick decided to leave the talking and go stretch his body with Jade. Haley, meanwhile, had finally decided to rest. But there was one spirit that kept bugging her. It kept flying around her and resenting her for pretending not to see him and not wanting to talk to him, even though he was quite handsome. Haley's tired, and there's also a chatty spirit questioning, is his face no longer competitive in today's world? Haley hurriedly answered him to get behind him and told him his face was competitive. Does he really want to seduce a ghost woman? The guy only laughed at that. Haley asked him to stop talking. She just wanted to rest, but he didn't understand why she didn't want to chat with him. I mean, he's a good spirit and he was interested in her, but Haley isn't interested in ghosts at all. She just wants to rest. He just laughed at that. He was interested in her as a person anyway. He's not a vengeful spirit, but a guardian spirit, so he didn't want her to be afraid. Tip didn't care if he was a guardian spirit or something else, because of people like him, she continues to participate in the afterlife. And after all, she wants to live like a normal person, except that even though she says so, she's making trouble for herself. This ghost already knew a lot of things. Haley scribbled on the ground, "Vengeful spirit, get lost." Sure, his face wasn't bad, he was quite handsome, but Haley didn't like younger people, and annoying ones like that in general. The spirit said it didn't matter. Still, he's very old, over 500 years old. Haley wasn't interested in that kind of thing. She just wanted to be left alone. Roderick and Jade sparred on the training ground. Jade was weaker than the king as the leader of the knight's troop and couldn't even get close to him. Roderick was actually surprised at how light his body was today, and he wanted to take another round, but he felt something strange and decided to stop. He got some strange feeling that Haley was very close by, so he ran in the direction he felt, but he didn't understand why he was drawn there. After all, it was a garden by the lake. He was very worried, because it was said that Haley had drowned herself in the river to avoid getting married. She was in a coma, and no one knew if she would wake up. Roderick was really starting to worry. There was something he didn't like about the situation. Haley was drawing something on the ground with her wand, while nearby, Vital was an annoying spirit. Haley asked, if he is a guardian spirit, why doesn't he help King Roderick? Haley wanted to know, had this man committed such a serious sin to deserve such suffering? The spirit had actually expected such a question. He would have loved to tell Haley about the sin Roderick had committed, but he couldn't really tell her that, because it's a mystery of nature, and it's up to Haley and Roderick to figure it out for themselves. She was disappointed. In the end, she was only left at a loss for talking to ghosts who only do what they themselves want. What happened or what's going on? No one can know and no one tells. And there's no Grandma Youngsin who wouldn't let you cross the line. Not anymore. It's a life slowly being destroyed, just like the past. And then, Itcha wondered, what are the fate lines for Haley in the body she now wears? Perhaps there are harbingers of bad luck. She looked at her hand, and it was clear that she was the bearer of failure after all. Suddenly, she heard someone call her name, Kang Ija. It was a little intimidating because she hadn't told this ghost her real name. After all, this ghost isn't simple and can see very far away. He even knows that Ija and Haley have already died once each, but he just didn't understand why she kept being afraid of something. The ghost spoke as if it didn't matter, and it was annoying, but there was no use getting angry at a ghost. Suddenly, he noticed Roderick coming and said so. Only he had a troubled look on his face, and he was surrounded by a string of evil spirits. The spirit joked that Roderick had found out that Haley was cheating on him, so he came like this, also bringing such a large army with him. The guardian spirit said she cleans them herself, so Haley could rest and have a good time. Then the horse appeared. The spirit sat on it and headed straight for the evil spirits. They immediately sensed the danger and started to run away. But of course, they didn't have time, because the guardian spirit quickly made them disappear. Haley looked at how strong the guardian's tattoo was. Then he could take his time and help the king, but he won't. Roderick ran up to Haley. You could see how worried he was and asked why she was here. The girl didn't make any excuses. Since she was a queen, she could even go into the king's bedroom whenever she wanted. She wasn't in a dungeon. She was just out for some fresh air now, and she wasn't thinking of jumping into the lake. Roderick calmed down a little and sat down beside her. He noticed Haley goofing around, drawing on the ground. He was picking out such cute expressions, and then he noticed that a familiar face could be seen in those drawings. Haley didn't understand how the king from the training ground knew she was here and came. It was unlikely that he could have been led here by that noble spirit, but either way, it was a very good trend for a patient that Haley treated regularly. King finished his workout, so Haley advised him to go to the woods. It was just the right time for shelving. It was actually a good solution to the problems. The king felt as if he were an animal trying to be commanded and trained. It was funny that Haley has such a different character from what others say about her. She thought about acting more believable, like Haley Duncan. But she'd never actually interacted with another person like that. The girl realized that the problem was that she was having so much fun being around Roderick and blushed. He noticed some strange behavior and thought she had something to say. Haley did have one request. She asked him to see a priest when he had time, because faith was a good thing, and she asked the king to also have regular checkups with the doctor to maintain his health. Roderick thought at first what these strange requests were, but then he realized it sounded like his wife's nagging. Well, he agreed to all these requests, and the first order of business was to go to Arthur's woods, so he suggested that Haley go along. She was having fun with the king, but she was afraid to delve into it completely, for it could become dangerous. However, maybe everything will be all right. She said that she had walked too much, and now her feet hurt, and it was better for the king to go to the forest alone and rest there. Roderick did not want to go there alone and offered to pick up Haley and carry her to the forest. That would be very disconcerting, so she decided to walk. And so they came to Arthur's forest, full of sacred energy, a beautiful place. And if the king comes here, his aura will be strengthened. No matter how hard Haley tries, she doesn't think she can clear even half of this man's energy. In fact, he wouldn't need the help of someone like her if he went here now. Suddenly, Roderick began to adjust Haley's dress, then abruptly lay down on her legs. It was becoming a regular thing for him. After a few times, he realized that he was getting a good night's sleep this way. He liked that position. Haley couldn't explain to him that it wasn't the position he was lying in that made him fall asleep. But now it turned out to be something nice. She was acting as his personal pillow. But if possible, he asked that she be a blanket for him in place of a pillow. Those words actually sounded obscene, Haley said, and Roderick asked, "Wasn't the way I adjusted her clothes last time obscene?" Roderick fully understood that this marriage was not a joyous occasion for Haley, but it was okay for the couple to joke around at least, right? He just wanted them to be able to communicate freely. Besides, the more he listened to Haley, the more interesting he found it. Secretly, he was waiting for her to say something strange again. Though this relationship was far from ordinary, but with many arguments and all sorts of conflicts, Roderick was still very comfortable. At such a sweet moment, he suddenly remembered that the annual hunting contest was coming up next month. Haley, of course, reacted very emotionally to this and even punched the king, accidentally, of course. She asked if the hunting contest could be canceled. Last year, the king barely managed to cancel it. This year, it should definitely be held. Unlike Haley, who loves animals so much that she is against hunting, her father is so crazy that he won't allow the hunt to be canceled. Duke Duncan will never help Haley. She was so upset about it, and her hands were shaking but clutching the king's head hard. He thought she loved animals very much. But Haley was just thinking about what measures she could take to make sure the king didn't kill anyone. The hunting competition is actually a social gathering place, since not only the king's men go there, there are many prying eyes around. The king doesn't want to show himself like this in front of people, so he was able to cancel the hunt last year, but this year should definitely be held. Haley immediately understood what he was worried about, and Roderick was glad that she understood him. Still, she's the one that's always trying to hide things from him. And it was incomprehensible how she could be so worried about him. Roderick has never once admitted his own madness about himself, because the words coming out of the emperor's mouth have enough weight to shake the entire empire, afraid that the moment he told anyone, he would turn into a truly insane king. But for some reason, it seemed calmer if he told Haley about it. Yes, she's the daughter of a political enemy who may have been sent to the palace to control the king. And Haley can run straight to her father, tell him as soon as the king shows weakness. But even knowing all these threats, he wanted to tell everything about himself and only Haley. Now, stroking her face, Roderick tried to tell her that he wasn't normal, that he was a destructive person, and that he was self-destructing every day and didn't know what he might do. It was hard for him, but now he was more sure than ever that he could tell her that. It was as if Haley knew everything and understood what he was trying to say, so she covered his mouth with her hands, words he didn't even voice. She immediately started denying it and said it wasn't true and everything was fine. She stroked his hair and then put her hand over his eyes to calm him down. Said it wasn't really like that and he could say no more. They both knew what they were talking about. Haley wanted to say that he wasn't crazy or broken. She knew that a man with such clear and pure eyes couldn't be, but unfortunately, she could only help him a little. Roderick was very surprised. He didn't think it would get easier, even if he didn't say anything, but it was all thanks to this amazing girl. Haley said that if he went to the hunting competition, she would tie him a handkerchief. Holding her hand, he thanked her. A few days later, when the election was held at the palace, some nobleman asked the king if he would not have a hunting competition this year as well. Of course, the one who raised the issue was Duke Duncan. He pretended to be worried about the health of the king, who had not spent the previous year hunting. Roderick looked at the vile duke and didn't understand how such a man could have a daughter like Haley. It was a shame, of course, but they were a little alike. Roderick was angry because of what he saw in that rogue face of his wife's. It annoyed him greatly, but now he had one gift for the duke. He took the documents that Trad had given him and was going to vent his anger a little. He threw the paper right on the table in front of Duke Duncan because it belonged to him. It was an anonymous complaint, but not a match between the duke's actual income from the estates and the taxes paid. Should the royal family launch an investigation? Roderick would certainly like to know more about it. For the duke himself had said he thought a great deal about the queen's honor when speaking of such things as Albert Duncan's reinstatement. Well, now the king is ready to answer those words again. Roderick would like the duke himself to stop defaming the queen's reputation. Roderick is very patient, especially turning a blind eye to the duke, but he has only given him one chance to make it right. Concluding this meeting, Roderick said, "Next month's hunting contest will go on as scheduled because I have chosen a good wife, and his health has improved so much since the wedding that he is very grateful to the queen." After that, the king left and said that others could disperse as well. Already out the door, he heard the rumble the duke was making, and with his anger. The duke noticed that the king had changed, and there was a glint in his eyes again, and his mood swings had diminished. So there was no way to get near him. The duke thought things would work out well after he made his daughter queen, but it's only gotten worse. And now the father is wondering, what is Haley even doing there? It was already night, and she was carving something out of the wood, causing him to hear a quiet crunch. Hear those sounds? Roderick woke up. He felt rested. First, he humiliated the head Duncan, and then he decided to sleep on the younger Duncan's bed. Roderick saw his wife making a second strange bracelet, but he noticed a pattern on the beads that looked like writing. Haley didn't just carve from the wood. She left hieroglyphics. To cast out, to destroy, to dissect, to destroy. She tried to make her wish as strong as possible before the clear bracelet she was currently using broke. It was necessary to make a new bracelet sooner rather than later, for this matter concerned her survival. So she was so focused that she didn't even talk to her husband. Roderick was getting a report that Haley Duncan is very interested in fashion, but it seems to be a sense of style that the current times are not yet ready to accept. And that report to him was, of course, made by Jade. Haley confessed that she doesn't make this bracelet because she thinks it's beautiful, but simply to improve her spirit. She was finally done for the day, and there wasn't much work left to be done there, but right now she needed to rest, and the king patted the bed beside her, beckoning his wife over. Jade and the rest of the servants thought it was time to leave, so the maid immediately dragged them out of the room. Haley felt some strange atmosphere, being alone in this room with Roderick. Since Arthur's last visit to the forest, the king has been napping in her room as often as he gets the chance. It happens often enough. Of course, other than the woods, this room is the cleanest. The frames here work with 24-hour protection. Haley would put him to sleep alone because she knew he could get a good night's sleep here. It was late tonight, but for some reason he wouldn't leave for his room, as if he'd decided to spend the night here, and Haley had a new lewd thought. She didn't know exactly what he wanted tonight. Roderick noticed some strange behavior. He just walked over to Haley, picked her up and carried her to bed like some kind of doll. After all, he understood that she might not be comfortable sleeping with him, and he could sleep on the couch so she could sleep soundly on the bed. Someone who barely found a comfortable spot would be kind of awkward to make him sleep there. Haley said the king could sleep on the bed too, and it was okay if they were together. Roderick seemed to be waiting for this, so he went straight to the bed and lay down. He was already used to this. Roderick was glad his wife wasn't a heartless person and didn't make him sleep on the couch. Once, just out of the blue, he climbed on top of her and asked her if she knew what she would have to do when she started sleeping in the same bed with him. He had a caustic smile on his face and asked, "Isn't it about time they did?" Haley's heart was pounding incredibly fast and her whole face was flushed. She was so embarrassed that she didn't know what to say, and eventually she froze as if she were an icy rock. Only then did Roderick say it was a joke to make her come to her senses. He lay down next to her again and said that it wasn't really a joke, but Haley didn't have to have trouble saying no. Haley actually wished she could do it too, but for some reason she couldn't say. She didn't understand her own feelings, though she was an expert when it came to ghosts. Roderick thought she needed to prepare herself mentally, since there was a man Haley loved enough to throw herself in the water just to avoid being with another. Come to think of it, this hunting competition should feature the man she used to love, Sir Lawrence. Lawrence Irwin is a knight with a prominent name in this kingdom. The king had heard of him before, but before his marriage to Haley, it didn't bother him at all. Now he decided to reread the report of Haley's investigation, compiled before the marriage. The longer he read, however, the more his face contorted. He called Jade and another worker over and started reprimanding them because he looked at the report regarding the queen again, and from start to finish, nothing adds up. How many times has he said the queen has strange tastes and likes to carve wood? But somehow the report says Haley Duncan likes sweet foods and desserts. It eats only greens because it does not like food that has a strong flavor. It eats as much as birds, but even if the food is slightly too salty, it loses its appetite and leaves. If everything Roderick had checked and observed for himself was not what he'd been told, could he really believe anything at all? There was a limit to how much he could turn a blind eye, and he was very angry that his subordinates had failed to do the job properly. What did he tell them? To check everything again and make a new report? And he gave them until the hunting contest was over. Roderick wondered why it bothered him so much. Maybe it was because he had a suspicion that Haley was hiding something. And then he remembered that she was wandering near the lake again without a chaperone, and he told Jade to watch carefully, because if something happened to her again, he wasn't going to let it go. A few days later, Haley was just taking a walk. She was looking very intently at something, and suddenly out of nowhere, a guardian spirit appeared with the question, "What are you looking at like that?" And the appearance was so sudden, and Haley was really scared. In fact, she'd been looking for him and waiting for him for days now, and he still hadn't shown up. The spirit only said it was because he wasn't an ordinary man, but he wondered why she was waiting for him so eagerly. The reason was obvious. Haley had asked the spirit to follow the king in the hunting contest and help, because it was dangerous for that man to leave the castle walls. And the spirit asked, then what can EJ do for him in return for his help? She was willing to do anything except risk her life and get hurt. The spirit was surprised, for he thought she loved the king more than life. But Haley didn't call it love. She was just being sympathetic to patients out of compassionate intentions. Either way, there was nothing the spirit wanted from her right now. On second thought, everything had already suggested she really try a relationship with him, and if it worked out, they'd get a taste of what she'd imagined last time. Haley blushed and said she hadn't imagined anything, but apparently there was no hiding anything from this ghost. She'd told him she liked older men, and he was 500 years old, a preference. But Haley still insisted that people should age well and die properly, and he was just a shameless ghost. But if that was really his only condition, she even considered it. She hadn't had time to agree to anything yet, but the ghost already thought she agreed and was pleased. Well, he said, "Kangije, relationships are much more beautiful than you think, and it's even more beautiful to be with the person you love. It is the privilege of human beings to surrender meaning and find happiness. The main thing is not to turn it into a basis for arranging the afterlife and not to hesitate. She's so young, but she keeps thinking strange things." The ghost told her to enjoy the future man. Of course, he alluded to her relationship with the king. Haley has said many times that he doesn't like Roderick. In any case, the ghost couldn't fulfill her request. He didn't understand what was in Haley's head at all. How could she try to make a deal with a spirit? Her life would be ruined if she did. If this cashew castle knows me critters, they would have pounced on Haley long ago. She realized the ghost was right, but she still couldn't do it with her powers. She'd tried the amulet above the warhammer instead, but it hadn't worked, and it would be suspicious to give the king the amulet with her on the road. Haley couldn't do anything, and her strength wasn't enough. So she'd have to make a few more by way of a major offensive. After all, she'd been working in the kitchen of a reclusive master for a long time. After putting her soul into those handkerchiefs and many wishes, Haley hasn't slept for several nights, and no matter how much she prays, she's still not sure she can protect King Roderick with her powers. It was a shame that a ghost would mock her and ask her questions like that if he wasn't originally going to help when Haley was at her most serious. She cried and talked about how much he annoyed her, but that didn't seem to please the ghost, and because she was overstepping her bounds, realized she had offended him and apologized. The ghost told her to remember to enjoy her life and left. Iya never really understood what he meant because he didn't help her in the end, and with hardly any time left before the hunting contest, she had to continue making handkerchiefs, which probably wouldn't help anything. Suddenly, she felt very dizzy, realized she was losing consciousness, and only at that moment remembered that she had drained her energy too much over the past few days. And the other problem was that she had told the maid not to follow her, and now no one would be coming to help for a long time yet. She had passed out. Eventually found Haley unconscious and brought him to the castle, of course very afraid the king would kill him. Roderick thought it was Haley's way of deciding to protest against him, but she certainly hadn't brought herself to this state on purpose at all, and she had no excuse. The doctor said it was lightheadedness and everything was fine, but Roderick didn't believe it was fine, since Haley had already passed out several times since entering the palace. It wasn't hard to count the number of times he'd fallen into madness, and each time Haley had gotten sick, but no one had even considered how it might be related. The king was greatly concerned about her, but it also bothered him that this marriage was hated by her. Iya just gives up quickly, and she married the king because she decided to humble herself and accept her fate. And he'd thought all along that she hated him and didn't even know his name, but Haley had said it wasn't true and had even given his full name, Roderick Ferris Blake. It was only after that that it got kind of awkward. The king was pleased that she knew his name perfectly well, though she had never once called him that. Well, now he said she could call him by his first name, Roderick, or just Rod. It was so unexpected of him to suggest a nickname. Haley was surprised. She thanked him for the opportunity, but she was going to keep calling him Your Majesty because she wanted to keep her distance. Because the closer she got to him, the more she wanted to help. To duck her head, she hid herself from the king, covering herself with a blanket. But the king was very annoyed, as if it were a secret technique of the Duncans to hurt a man with a single word that is passed down from generation to generation. He immediately started pulling the blanket off of Haley, who was already laughing loudly. Roderick suddenly thought he must like her because every time she tried to keep her distance, he got annoyed. And when he sees her laughing, his mood immediately improves. She's like a fox with pink fur. When he called her a fox, Haley said he was overestimating her because she remembered the fox ghost, which lure humans to them. And even in the ghost world, foxes are highly regarded. But they're actually very scary. Haley took the mere joke as praise, and of course the king didn't realize it. Then suddenly she asked, "Is the king really going to go to the hunting contest? Is it true he can't back down?" Roderick thought again that she was obsessed with animals and still worried about it, but he had to go hunting and leave Haley behind. Asking that perverted spirit for help had failed, and even embroidered handkerchiefs weren't that effective. And if what had happened the last time he'd come back from a hunting trip happened, Haley was very worried. She asked if even one arm was broken, could the hunting contest not be canceled? Roderick was very surprised to hear her say that, and Haley had even offered to break his leg in all seriousness. Roderick couldn't contain his laughter, because with wrists that thin, Haley wouldn't even be able to break his finger. But she said in all seriousness that she wasn't going to do that, because there's Jade, and you can ask him to do that. Haley was so serious. There was no other way to help the king besides handkerchiefs after all. Roderick was surprised at first that she was actually going to give him a handkerchief. And then he remembered that Haley had Lawrence. And then for some reason, the mood soured. Haley asked why on earth he was so eager to get a handkerchief that was useless at all. Can't even chase away ghosts. That was the biggest problem. But Roderick did not understand why she spoke in that way. He thought she was trying to say that she did not want to give him the handkerchief afterward and feel less regret. Of course it was rude to say so, but she was the first to offer him a handkerchief, and he was beginning to hope that it would be a shame if she changed her mind. He lay down next to her and said that this conversation was actually hurting him mentally. Haley said she would give him a tissue, so there was no need to hesitate. Roderick did not know whether to doubt whether she would give the handkerchief or whether she was hiding much from him. If she plans to take, then let her continue to do so. But sometimes she gives herself away too much. As soon as he thought about it, it was as if Haley read his mind and said it wasn't a lie, and she really had made the handkerchief for him, and then pointed her finger at the mountain of tissues on her desk. Roderick hadn't expected there to be so many, and thought she wasn't just going to hand out all those handkerchiefs to him. Plus, that weird sense of aesthetics was striking again. Then he realized that her health was failing because she was making all these shawls, and even her hands were all abrasions. When she keeps her distance, it makes Roderick angry, but when she laughs, it makes him feel warm. Right now, he doesn't like that she's risking her health to make handkerchiefs, but he's happy that she wants to keep the promise she made. He put Haley on the bed and told her to rest. Besides, she was completely pale. He didn't like that there were so many tissues, but even if she handed out tissues to everyone but him, he wouldn't say anything. Haley realized that he thought they were handkerchiefs for others, which was why they were so cute at his place. I wonder his reaction when he finds out it's all for him. But before the hunting contest, she wasn't going to tell him anything because it's annoying that he ridicules and suspects her. Suddenly, he asked the embarrassing question of whether she wanted to use his hand as a pillow. But since they're husband and wife, such a thing is allowed, so Haley didn't bother to say no. She had never laid on his arm and didn't know if she could lie like that, but Roderick had said that if she lay on his wrist, the blood wouldn't circulate through his arm and she should lie closer. Well, she did as he said, and then they both blushed. Roderick, for some reason, was happy, realizing that Haley had never had that with another man. Now they didn't know what to do in this situation, sleep or what. Roderick was teasing Haley as usual, so she said she might even get angry. And after all, she is a very fierce person, but he only laughed off that. She realized he was amused by this sort of thing, so she continued to joke about uncontrolled anger raging internally and so on. It was very funny, but Roderick still thought she didn't know how to share. She always takes a step back, as if preparing to distance herself from him. To Roderick, this is strange. Haley sometimes looks like she is lonely and sad. King thought it was because of her father who raised her using beatings. It was hard to understand how anyone could ever hit someone so small. They lay for a while longer, and then Roderick asked something that had been bothering him for some time. He asked her why she kept looking at the lake with such a gloomy look, as if she wanted to die. Haley couldn't answer that the whole problem was about him. But throwing around words about death shouldn't be allowed. If there was a problem, why wouldn't Roderick solve it? It really bothers him because she's his wife. So he's going to take care of the problem. Well, he really is a good man, having said himself that there was no other choice but wheat. But for some reason, he continues to treat Haley so affectionately. The brief glances he casts at her, she notices even the slightest, and the touches that seem casual, and the kindness he shows her. These feelings, which also seemed like a small price to pay, gradually accumulated step by step. And after realizing that this is what she's wanted all her life, she doesn't want to stop. Even if there's a heavy price to pay someday, what King Roderick gave her must have been warmth. So it's him that's the problem because he took away her ability to pretend she didn't notice anything. He was now her pillow and could cover her with a blanket so she could sleep comfortably. He no longer asked her the hard questions. Haley was a little embarrassed and wished him good night and to dream tonight. Such a cute look really surprised Roderick, and he felt like he was going crazy, but still held back. So the time flew by and the day of the hunting competition came. This time, maybe there were a lot of tents and carts and a lot of people there. The Emperor was busy discussing and commanding, so Haley couldn't approach him right now. And besides, she was just finishing her own preparations. The servant Deborah said that seeing the queen dressed like this would give the king a boost of strength and victory. But there's nothing good about him holding first place in the competition. Haley is strongly against killing. She would like him to take the last place because she has to take care of the consequences and then spend a lot of energy. She had to see the king off now and then return to the palace. The competition would start soon, so she decided to look around a bit. Haley chose 3 of the most well-made and powerful handkerchiefs. She was going to give them to her husband because the maid had convinced her to choose only 3 because it would be too much to take a whole mountain of handkerchiefs. Everyone noticed at once when the queen came out of the tent and noticed that her shawls seemed so scary. Roderick was already sitting on his horse. He realized at once that his wife had finished her preparations, but because she was so small, he couldn't see where she was going. But he saw at once that Lawrence Irwin was standing nearby as if waiting for something. Haley couldn't see anything in the distance and couldn't figure out where she should go to reach the Emperor. It took a long time to get to him, and Roderick also laughed off the fact that she was so small and hard to live in this world. He'd provoked her on purpose, just so he could hear her get angry like last time. But the closer she came to him, the more he noticed that the air had changed again with her arrival. He said it out loud, and Jade was just sorry to hear it. He took it as if the king was saying that this woman was like a breath of air. Haley felt like a ghost. She pulled out 3 prepared handkerchiefs that had prayers on them to exorcise evil spirits. Roderick was pleased when he saw that she had brought him a shawl after all, and then watched her tie them on the outfit. Next, a spell to wish victory and a spell to avoid karma. She asked His Majesty to just keep it to herself during the competition. She said she did a lot more. She only brought us the best ones. Roderick asked, was that large amount all meant for him? She said she did because he was her husband. Who else would she give them to? It was embarrassing because of the fact that she hadn't said it before, like a real fox. Roderick did not understand why she had issued him 3 pieces, but she said to take it as if it were 3 years in advance. He promised to treasure them, and he was glad indeed. They all belonged to him now. It was cute to watch him squeeze them with his big hands, and it was noticeable how a little shy he was. Well, he asked what to catch for Haley, but she said she wasn't interested in that kind of thing because she was against murder. This was strange to Roderick, for those who go hunting but return to their wives empty-handed are real fools. She asked, does he really think he isn't that stupid? Of course he did. She didn't want him to win, even though the contest was essentially a competition. Her ex, Lawrence, noticed a familiar face in the crowd and began to look closely at the familiar different hair. Haley looked around at this point. By this, all the people here must have their own competition or battle of the spirit. Of course, she always hoped Roderick would win. If he was winning and nothing happened in the process, that would be all right. But in his current state, he shouldn't be allowed to commit murder. Haley really wanted to ask him to be gentler and for his pride not to be hurt. But she wouldn't say it, because Roderick sits on the throne after all, and he has his reasons, which she may not know. So the only thing she can say is that he was uninjured and was coming back in one piece. Suddenly, they both noticed a commotion in the crowd. Lawrence was trying to get between people to get to Haley. The king didn't expect Lawrence to try to approach, but then everyone abruptly started whispering, saying, "To the queen!" And when Roderick looked at his wife, he saw her crying. It was the first time he had ever seen such a desperate expression on her face. The girl herself did not understand what was happening, but a whole flood of memories appeared in front of her eyes, thanks to which she realized that it was Haley's lover. It was a whole rush of romantic moments and memories, but now was not the time or place to reminisce about it, especially with so many people looking at her. The queen weeps as she looks at her past lover. Then King Roderick will be... what will he do? Everything was happening very quickly and suddenly with this situation, but Roderick was not confused. He immediately got down from his horse, told Lawrence to leave, and hugged Haley to calm her down. He asked her questions to distract her, but her tears still wouldn't stop. Haley knew she'd made a mistake and apologized, but she still couldn't calm down. She was going to make it very difficult for him now, and she had brought it up. Roderick didn't understand why she was crying and apologizing as if she'd done something wrong. It was her condition that bothered him most of all. He said that she shouldn't worry because she was so small and must be killed, or only 13 people. Besides, she closed right away. She had good reactions and she was very agile. With such words, he encouraged her. So Haley was getting better, and the few people who saw her tears didn't immediately realize what had happened and thought they were imagining it. Roderick quickly lifted Haley's spirits, so she laughed. He hugged her, so he let her wipe her tears on his clothes, but asked her not to blow her nose, though he let her wipe her nose afterward. Because of Roderick's good, quick reaction, people began to think that the queen was crying because she had to part with her husband for a few days, and they would not see each other until after the contest. It was the first time people saw such an inseparable, cute couple. Well, when she came to her senses, Roderick said, "Lift your head and pretend as if nothing had happened." The king continued to crack jokes in his repertoire, but instead of Haley's face was nothing but joy at marrying him. She apologized again for what had happened, because she hadn't cried on purpose, but the main thing was that everything was fine now. She was still worried, so Roderick got the idea to create a broader topic of discussion among the humans. She has a lot of responsibility today, so they should cooperate. Roderick used that silly excuse, moving closer to Haley. Still, before he kissed her, he expected at least some sort of reaction, but Haley closed her eyes and pulled her lips away. Roderick even laughed after that, after which he kissed Haley. It was such a passionate kiss, and he didn't want to stop, so ended up going a little overboard and even using my own language. But Haley still didn't resist, and only squeezed the edge of her clothes in embarrassment, whereupon Roderick laughed again, and kissed Haley one more time. It was long enough so everyone definitely had time to see. It wasn't until after the kiss that he said he didn't really do it for attention. but just because he wanted to.